The crowd was already screaming her name when Elira opened her eyes. Not her real name, they never used that. They called her the Silent One, the Broken One, the girl who did not deserve to stand among wolves. Someone had painted those words on a wooden board and nailed it to the post where she now stood, wrists bound loosely with rope, feet bare on the cold stone of the pack square. The morning air smelled of smoke and wet pine, and every breath she took felt like it belonged to someone else. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears only fed them. The pack elders stood at the front of the crowd, arms crossed, faces carved from disappointment. Behind them, dozens of younger wolves jeered and laughed, throwing small stones that struck her arms and legs, none hard enough to truly hurt, but each one a reminder of exactly where she stood in the order of things. At the very bottom, lower than the newest pups, lower than the dirt beneath the training grounds. An omega with no voice. Nobody in Emberfall Hollow could remember the last time Elira had spoken a single word. Some said she had been born mute. Others whispered that the trauma of losing her family as a small child had stolen her voice and never given it back. The truth was far stranger than either story, but no one alive except Elira herself knew it, and she intended to keep it that way, even now, even here, with humiliation pressing down on her like a physical weight. The ritual was called the Marking of Shame. It was supposed to have ended a generation ago, back when the pack still followed the old harsh customs, but Alpha Garrick had revived it 2 years earlier, claiming it built discipline. In truth, everyone knew it was simply a tool he used to remind the pack who held power, and to remind the weakest among them exactly how weak they were. Elira had endured it 3 times before. She had learned to let her mind drift somewhere else, while her body stayed rooted to the post, to imagine herself standing on a hill far from this place, wind moving through grass instead of rope biting into her skin. She tried to find that hill now, closing her eyes, listening to her own heartbeat instead of the crowd. But something felt different today. She noticed it first in the air itself, a subtle pressure change, like the moment before a storm breaks. The wolves nearest the square gates had gone quiet, their laughter fading into confused murmurs. Elira opened her eyes and saw heads turning, one after another, toward the eastern road that led out of Emberfall Hollow, and toward the wider world beyond the mountains. A rider had appeared on that road, then another, then a line of them, moving in perfect formation, banners rising above their heads that caught the weak morning light and turned it to gold. Alpha Garrick's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to something closer to alarm. He stepped forward, motioning for his enforcers to lower their stones, and the crowd, sensing the change in him, quieted almost instantly. Even the youngest pups stopped their taunting and stared toward the horizon. Elira felt her pulse quicken, though she could not explain why. She had heard stories about that banner, gold thread on deep crimson cloth, the shape of a wolf howling beneath a crown of stars. It was the mark of the royal wolves, the ancient legion sworn to serve the bloodline of the first Wolf King, a bloodline most packs believed had died out a century ago, in a war no one spoke of anymore. If the royal wolves were riding toward Emberfall Hollow, it meant something had changed in the world beyond the mountains, and Alpha Garrick clearly had no idea what that something was. "Cut her down," he barked at one of his enforcers, a broad-shouldered wolf named Doran, who had personally tied Elira to the post that morning with obvious enjoyment. Doran hesitated only a second before rushing to obey, fumbling with the rope at her wrists. Elira rubbed the raw skin where the bindings had been, but she did not move from the platform. Something inside her, a small quiet voice she had spent years pushing down, told her to stay exactly where she was and watch. The line of riders drew closer, and now she could make out details. There were perhaps 30 of them visible on the road, though rumor and instinct told her many more marched behind, out of sight beyond the tree line. Each wore dark leather armor etched with silver patterns that seemed to shift and catch light strangely, as if the metal itself remembered old magic. At the front of the formation rode a single figure on a black horse, taller than the others, his posture rigid and controlled, his face unreadable, even from this distance. Elira's chest tightened. She told herself it was simply nerves, the natural reaction any wolf would have when facing the arrival of the legendary royal wolves. But some deeper part of her recognized something else stirring beneath her ribs, a pull she had felt only once before, long ago, in a memory she kept locked away behind years of careful silence. The formation stopped at the edge of the pack square, close enough now that Alira could see the commander's eyes, sharp and pale, sweeping across the gathered crowd with the precision of a hawk searching for movement in tall grass. Alpha Garrick straightened his shoulders and stepped forward to greet them, forcing warmth into his voice that did not reach his eyes. "Commander," Garrick said, bowing his head just enough to show respect without submission. "Emberfall Hollow welcomes the Royal Wolves. We received no word of your approach. Had we known, we would have prepared a proper reception." The commander did not dismount immediately. His gaze drifted past Garrick, sweeping over the crowd, the wooden post, the discarded rope on the ground, and finally landing on Alira herself, standing barefoot and disheveled at the edge of the platform. For a long moment, his expression did not change. Then something flickered behind his pale eyes, so brief that Alira almost convinced herself she had imagined it. He looked away and addressed Garrick instead. "We travel through your territory as part of a routine inspection of the northern packs, nothing more. We will require lodging for one night, and access to your council records." Garrick's smile tightened at the mention of records, but he nodded quickly. "Of course, anything the Royal Legion requires." As the enforcers began clearing space for the visiting soldiers, Alira slipped quietly toward the edge of the square, hoping to disappear into the crowd the way she always did, unseen and unimportant. She had almost reached the shadow of the old grain house when she felt it again, that same strange pull, stronger this time, like an invisible thread tugging gently at the center of her chest. She turned, and found the commander watching her. Only for a heartbeat, then a young officer approached him with a question about stabling the horses, and his attention moved elsewhere, leaving Alira standing frozen in the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs for reasons she could not name. She spent the rest of the day working in the kitchens, as she did every day, chopping vegetables and hauling water, while the rest of the pack whispered about the visiting legion. No one asked Alira what she thought of the arrival. No one ever asked Alira what she thought of anything. She had grown used to being invisible in every room she entered, a shadow among wolves who barely remembered her name, let alone her history. But invisibility had its uses. It meant she could stand near the council hall that evening, arms full of firewood, and listen while the door stood slightly ajar. Inside, Garrick's voice carried an edge of nervous energy she rarely heard from him. "Commander, surely there is no need to review records going back that far. Emberfall Hollow has always paid its tributes, followed every law set by the royal court." The commander's reply was calm, measured, and utterly without warmth. "The inspection is not about tribute, Alpha Garrick. We are searching for descendants of a particular bloodline, one believed extinguished during the fall of the old royal house, a century past. New information has come to light suggesting at least one line may have survived, hidden among the northern packs." A long silence followed. Alira stood frozen outside the door, firewood forgotten in her arms, her pulse roaring in her ears. "A bloodline," Garrick repeated carefully. "Which one exactly?" "The line of Nadia Sunwood," the commander said, "once heir to the throne of the first Wolf King, before the purge that claimed her family 30 years ago. If any child of that line still lives, our legion is bound by ancient oath to recognize and protect them, regardless of the cost." Alira's knees nearly buckled beneath her. The firewood clattered from her arms onto the stone path, the sound sharp and sudden in the quiet evening air. Footsteps moved quickly inside the hall, and she barely managed to gather the scattered wood and slip away into the darkness before the door opened behind her. She did not look back to see who had come to investigate the noise. She simply ran, bare feet slapping against cold stone, until she reached the small storage room behind the kitchens that served as her sleeping quarters, and there, in the darkness, she finally allowed herself to shake. Nadia Sunwood, her mother's name, spoken aloud for the first time in years by someone other than herself, in a place where anyone might have heard it. Alira had been 4 years old when the men came for her family. She remembered fragments only, disjointed and painful, the kind of memories that surfaced in nightmares rather than clear daylight thought. She remembered her mother's hands, warm and shaking, pressing something cold and metal into her palm and closing her small fingers around it. She remembered being told, in a whisper fierce with desperation, that she must never speak her true name again, never tell anyone where she came from, never reveal what ran in her blood, no matter what happened. no matter how long it took for the danger to pass. She remembered running through darkness with an old wolf named Petra, a servant loyal to her mother, who carried her for miles until her small legs gave out, and Petra's did too. She remembered arriving at Emberfall Hollow half-starved and half-frozen, and Petra telling the pack elders a careful lie about an orphaned pup with no family and no name. Petra had died 3 winters later, taking whatever else she knew of Alira's past with her into the frozen ground, and Alira, only 7 years old and terrified beyond words, had kept her promise. She had stopped speaking entirely, not because her voice was broken, but because silence felt like the only wall standing between her and whatever fate had claimed her mother. Now, 17 years later, that wall was cracking, and she had no idea whether to feel terror or something dangerously close to hope. She reached beneath the loose floorboard in the corner of her small room, the same hiding place she had used since childhood, and withdrew a small object wrapped carefully in cloth. It was a ring, simple in design but heavy with age, its surface engraved with a symbol she had never shown another living soul, a wolf howling beneath a crown of stars. The exact symbol that had flown on the banners riding into Emberfall Hollow that very morning. Alira sat in the darkness for a long time, turning the ring over and over in her fingers, listening to the distant sounds of the pack settling into evening routines, unaware that everything was about to change. Somewhere beyond her small room, the commander of the Royal Wolves sat with Alpha Garrick, poring over records that held no answers, searching for a name that had not existed in this pack's official history for 17 years. But records were not the only way to find the truth. Bloodlines carried their own recognition, older and deeper than any written word, and though Alira did not yet understand the full weight of what slept within her, something in the Legion camped just beyond the pack square had already begun to stir, restless and waiting, as if sensing that the one they had searched for 100 years might finally be close enough to feel. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of leather and steel from the visiting soldiers' camp toward the small storage room where Alira sat holding her mother's ring. For the first time in 17 years, she allowed herself to whisper a single word into the darkness, so quiet that even she barely heard it. Soon. She did not know yet what that word meant, or what price it might carry. She only knew that the silence she had worn like armor for so long was no longer entirely her own choice to keep. Somewhere out there, 10,000 warriors bound by an ancient oath were searching for her, and whether she wanted it or not, the moment of recognition was coming. She wrapped the ring back in its cloth, tucked it beneath the floorboard, and lay down on her thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, until exhaustion finally pulled her toward an uneasy sleep. Tomorrow, the Royal Wolves would continue their inspection. Tomorrow, Alpha Garrick would grow more anxious, more desperate to hide whatever secrets he feared they might uncover. And tomorrow, though Alira could not have known it yet, fate would begin closing the distance between the silent girl at the bottom of the pack and the destiny that had been waiting for her since the night her mother pressed a ring into her hand and told her to run. Morning came too fast. Alira woke to the sound of pots clanging in the kitchen above her small room, and for a moment, lying in the gray pre-dawn light, she almost convinced herself that the previous day had been nothing more than a strange dream. Then she felt the hard edge of the floorboard beneath her mattress, the one hiding her mother's ring, and the memory of the commander's words rushed back with full force. A bloodline believed extinguished, a child who might still live. She rose quickly, dressed in her plain gray tunic, and made her way to the kitchens before the head cook, a stern older wolf named Ottavia, could scold her for lateness. The kitchens were already buzzing with nervous energy, servants whispering about the visiting legion, about how many soldiers had actually made camp beyond the northern wall, about whether the Royal Wolves might stay longer than one night after all. "They say the commander barely slept," one of the younger kitchen girls whispered to another, as Alira passed with an armful of firewood. He had the council records brought to his tent, instead of returning them this morning. Something about them troubled him. Alira kept her expression carefully blank and continued her work, though her hands trembled slightly as she stacked the wood beside the ovens. She had spent her entire life training herself not to react, not to let anyone read anything in her face, and that discipline held now, even as her mind raced through possibilities she barely dared to consider. By mid-morning, she had been sent to deliver bread and dried meat to the visiting soldiers' camp, a task normally given to servants with more standing in the pack. But today every able body had been pressed into service to accommodate the unexpected guests. Illyra carried a heavy basket through the northern gate and into a world she had never seen up close. Rows of dark tents, arranged in perfect symmetry, soldiers moving with quiet efficiency, weapons cleaned and stacked with obvious care. No one paid her much attention as she moved between the tents, delivering food where directed by a young officer with tired eyes and a kind voice, entirely unlike what she had expected from soldiers of such fearsome reputation. She found herself relaxing slightly, falling into the rhythm of simple work, when she rounded a tent corner and nearly collided with the commander himself. He caught the basket before it could tip, steadying it with one hand, while his pale eyes studied her face, with an intensity that made her stomach twist into knots. Up close, he looked younger than she had expected, his features sharp and serious, a thin scar running along his jaw that spoke of old battles survived rather than avoided. "Careful," he said simply, releasing the basket once it was steady again. Illyra nodded, unable to trust her own voice even if she had wanted to use it, and moved to step around him. But he did not move aside immediately, and for a long, strange moment, they simply stood there, close enough that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion beneath his eyes, evidence of a sleepless night, spent searching through old records for answers he had not yet found. "You work in the kitchens," he said, though it was not quite a question. She nodded again. "How long have you lived in Emberfall Hollow?" Illyra hesitated, then held up both hands, fingers spread, then closed them, and opened 7 fingers total, a silent counting she had perfected over years of communicating without words. 17 years. Something shifted in the commander's expression, subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around his eyes that suggested the number meant something significant to him. "You do not speak," he said quietly. It was not cruel, the way others often made it sound, simply an observation, careful and measured. Illyra shook her head. "Have you always been silent, or was there a reason?" The question landed heavier than he likely intended, and Illyra felt her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear of punishment, and everything to do with the terrifying possibility that this stranger might already suspect more than he was letting on. She lowered her eyes, adjusting the basket in her arms, and stepped past him without answering, walking quickly toward the next row of tents before he could ask anything further. Behind her, she heard him exhale slowly, and though she did not turn to look, she could feel his gaze following her retreat until she disappeared behind the next line of canvas. She finished her deliveries in a daze, her mind replaying the encounter over and over, searching for any sign that he had recognized something in her, any flicker of certainty that might explain the strange pull she had felt since his arrival. By the time she returned to the kitchens, the sun had climbed high overhead, and Ottavia immediately set her to peeling vegetables for the evening meal, oblivious to the storm building quietly inside her youngest and quietest worker. It was there, hands busy with mundane work, that Talia found her. Talia was one of the few wolves in Emberfall Hollow who treated Illyra with something resembling genuine kindness, a young healer's apprentice with an easy laugh, and no patience for the pack's cruelty toward those it deemed unworthy. She dropped onto the bench beside Illyra with a tired sigh, reaching for a knife to help with the vegetables. "You missed quite a scene this morning," Talia said, keeping her voice low. "Garrick tried to convince the commander that the old census records from before your arrival were destroyed in a fire. The commander did not believe him, asked to speak with anyone who might remember refugees arriving in the pack around 18 years ago. She glanced sideways at Illyra, something knowing in her expression. "You arrived around then, didn't you? With old Petra?" Illyra's hands stilled over the vegetables for just a moment, before resuming their work, careful and steady, betraying nothing. Talia did not push further, simply continued peeling in companionable silence for a while before speaking again, her voice even quieter now. "Whatever this is about, Illyra, I hope it brings you something good. You deserve that, after everything this pack has put you through." She hesitated, then added, almost to herself, "There is something different about you today. I cannot explain it. Like a held breath finally about to release." Illyra looked up at her friend, and for the briefest moment, considered breaking 17 years of silence right there in the kitchen, telling Talia everything, the ring beneath the floorboard, her mother's whispered warning, the terror and impossible hope tangled together in her chest since the moment those crimson banners appeared on the horizon. But old habits ran deep, and fear ran deeper. She simply squeezed Talia's hand once, a gesture of gratitude that carried more meaning than words could have managed, and returned to her work. The afternoon passed in a blur of chores and stolen glances toward the northern camp, where the royal wolves continued their inspection with growing intensity. By evening, word had spread through the pack that Alpha Garrick had grown visibly agitated, snapping at his enforcers and canceling the celebratory feast he had originally planned in honor of the Legion's visit. Something had shifted, though no one in the lower ranks of the pack understood exactly what. Elira understood better than anyone, though she kept that understanding locked tightly behind her practiced silence. That night, as she lay once again on her thin mattress, she retrieved the ring from beneath the floorboard and studied it in the dim moonlight filtering through the small window above her bed. The howling wolf beneath its crown of stars seemed almost alive in the shifting light, ancient and patient, waiting the way she herself had waited for 17 long years. Tomorrow, the Legion was scheduled to depart, continuing their inspection of other northern packs. Whatever answers they sought here in Emberfall Hollow, they had apparently not yet found them, buried as they were beneath false records and a pack elder's desperate lies. But Elira knew something Alpha Garrick did not. She knew that marking of shame ritual, cancelled tonight due to the unexpected disruption of royal visitors, had merely been postponed, not abandoned. Garrick had made that much clear to his enforcers before storming off toward his private quarters, his voice sharp with barely restrained fury. The ritual would take place the following morning instead, one final display of dominance, before the visiting Legion departed, a reminder to his own pack of exactly who held power within these walls, regardless of who watched from beyond them. Elira closed her eyes, gripping the ring tightly in her palm, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to imagine a future different from the one she had accepted as inevitable. A future where silence was a choice, rather than a cage. A future where the name Nadia Sunwood's daughter might mean something other than danger. She did not know yet that tomorrow's ritual, meant as one final act of cruelty before the Legion's departure, would become the very moment everything changed. She did not know that the commander, despite his failure to find written proof, had not stopped searching, had in fact noticed far more in their brief encounter than his careful expression revealed. She did not know that somewhere within the visiting camp, 10,000 soldiers carried within their blood an ancient oath, capable of recognizing what records and lies could never fully hide. She only knew, as sleep finally claimed her, that something was coming, and for the first time in 17 years, she found herself unafraid to face it. Commander Dorian Ashgrave had not slept in 2 nights, and yet his mind felt sharper than it had in months. He sat alone in his tent long after the camp had gone quiet. The false census records Alpha Garrick had provided spread across the table before him, useless and full of holes. Someone in this pack had gone to great trouble to erase the arrival of refugees from 18 years past, and people did not erase records unless they had something worth hiding. He thought of the kitchen girl he had encountered between the tents, her silence, the careful way she had counted 17 years on her fingers, rather than risk speaking, the flicker of something unreadable in her eyes when he asked about her past. He had interviewed hundreds of possible bloodline candidates over the years the Legion had spent searching, and none of them had left this particular feeling lodged beneath his ribs, a certainty without proof, instinct without evidence. Dorian had been a boy of 12 when the Sunwood line fell. He remembered little of that night beyond chaos and fire and his own father, then commander of the Legion, riding out with every soldier under his command, in a desperate attempt to protect the royal family from betrayal within their own court. His father had returned 3 days later, with grief carved permanently into his face, having found no survivors, only ash and silence where a royal house had once stood. The Legion's oath was ancient, older than any pack alive today could fully explain, a binding tied to the blood of the first Wolf King's line, passed down through countless generations of soldiers sworn to protect and serve whoever carried that blood, recognized instinctively the moment true contact occurred, whether the bearer knew their own nature or not. For 30 years, the Legion had operated without a royal line to serve, following instead the council of elder commanders, waiting, always waiting, for a sign that the bloodline had not truly ended. 6 months ago, That sign had finally come. A dying informant in a southern territory had spoken of a woman named Nadia Sunwood, last heir to the fallen royal house, who had survived the purge only to die years later while protecting a small child, a daughter smuggled north by a loyal servant before the assassins could finish their work. The informant had known no further details, no name for the child, no location for where she might have ended up, only that the northern packs, scattered and disorganized as they were, offered the best chance for such a child to have disappeared successfully into obscurity. For 6 months, Dorian had led his legion through pack after pack in the north, searching for any trace of that lost child, now grown into a woman roughly his own age, 21 years old if the timeline held true. He had begun to fear the search was hopeless, that too much time had passed, that whatever trail existed had gone cold decades ago. Then he had ridden into Emberfall Hollow and felt something shift the moment he crossed into the pack square. He rose from his table now, restless, and stepped outside his tent into the cool night air. The camp stretched around him in orderly rows, soldiers sleeping in shifts, sentries alert at every perimeter point, the entire legion functioning with the precision of a single unified body, rather than 10,000 separate wolves. That unity was itself a product of the ancient oath, a bond that ran deeper than ordinary loyalty, deeper even than the loyalty most packs felt toward their own alphas. Dorian walked the perimeter of the camp slowly, his thoughts circling back again and again to the silent kitchen girl. He had noticed the way the other pack members treated her, the careful distance they kept, the way even the servants avoided meeting her eyes. It was the treatment reserved for someone the pack considered beneath consideration, an Omega with no status and apparently no history worth acknowledging. And yet Alpha Garrick had gone to considerable trouble destroying records from precisely the period when she claimed to have arrived in the pack. He returned to his tent as the first hints of dawn began coloring the eastern sky, and found his second in command, a steady older soldier named Corwin Blackthorne, waiting for him with a report. "The men have finished packing the supply wagons," Corwin said. "We can depart within the hour, as planned, and reach the next pack territory before nightfall." Dorian did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the pack square visible beyond the camp's edge, where servants were already beginning to gather wood and prepare for the day's activities. "Something troubles you, Commander," Corwin observed, not quite a question. "There is a girl in this pack," Dorian said slowly, "a kitchen servant, silent, by choice or circumstance. No one seems entirely certain which. She arrived here roughly 18 years ago, around the same time our informant's timeline suggests the Sunwood child would have reached this territory, if the northern route was taken." Corwin's expression sharpened with interest. "You believe she might be the one we search for?" "I do not know," Dorian admitted, a rare acknowledgement of uncertainty from a commander known throughout the Legion for his unwavering confidence. "But Garrick has destroyed the records that might have confirmed or denied her origins, and that alone tells me something worth investigating further." "The oath would recognize her instantly, if she carries the blood," Corwin pointed out. "Perhaps we simply need proximity, and time, for the recognition to occur naturally. Forcing the matter through interrogation may only drive whatever truth exists further into hiding." Dorian considered this, turning it over in his mind, alongside everything else he had observed. The Legion's oath was not something easily controlled or predicted, a mysterious inheritance from ancient magic none of them fully understood, capable of manifesting in unexpected ways when true royal blood came near, enough soldiers bound by that ancient promise. Forcing recognition through questioning would accomplish nothing. Only genuine proximity, and perhaps time, could reveal what records and careful denial had worked so hard to conceal. "We delay our departure," Dorian decided finally. "One additional day. I want to observe this pack's daily activities more closely before we move on." Corwin nodded, unsurprised by the decision, and moved to relay new orders to the waiting soldiers. Dorian remained standing at the edge of camp, watching the pack square slowly come alive with morning activity, servants moving between buildings, the distant sound of Alpha Garrick's voice raised in irritation about some matter Dorian could not quite make out. He noticed, as the morning progressed, an unusual gathering forming near the center of the square, a wooden post standing prominently amid a growing crowd, expressions on the gathered wolves, ranging from eager anticipation to visible discomfort. Something was clearly about to happen, some kind of pack ceremony or ritual that Dorian had not been informed about. He found Alpha Garrick near the edge of the crowd, deep in conversation with one of his enforcers, and approached with measured steps. "Alpha Garrick," Dorian said, his tone carefully neutral. "I was under the impression our legion would be departing this morning. I see your pack has other activities planned." Garrick's expression flickered with obvious discomfort at being caught in what was clearly meant to remain hidden from royal observation. "A minor pack matter, Commander. Nothing that concerns the Legion's business. We can proceed with your departure preparations regardless." "What kind of matter requires such a public gathering?" Dorian pressed, his instincts, honed over years of investigation, telling him that whatever Garrick wished to hide deserved closer examination. Garrick hesitated, clearly weighing the risk of lying directly to a royal commander against the discomfort of admitting the truth. "A disciplinary ritual," he finally admitted, choosing his words with obvious care. "For a pack member who has repeatedly failed to meet the standards expected of Emberfall Hollow. Nothing that concerns matters of royal bloodlines, I assure you." Something cold settled in Dorian's chest at the phrase disciplinary ritual. Memories of similar practices he had witnessed in other troubled packs during the Legion's long journey. Cruel traditions dressed up as discipline, designed primarily to reinforce hierarchies of power through public humiliation of those with the least ability to resist. "I would like to observe," he said, his tone leaving no room for refusal, despite the polite phrasing. Garrick's jaw tightened, but he nodded stiffly, apparently unwilling to risk offending a royal commander further by denying such a request. "Of course. Though I must warn you, it is not a particularly pleasant spectacle for outside eyes." "I have witnessed a great many unpleasant things in my years of service," Dorian replied evenly. "I doubt your pack's traditions will trouble me overly much." He would remember that statement, in the days and years that followed, as one of the great underestimations of his life. The crowd continued growing as the morning progressed, pack members gathering from every corner of Emberfall Hollow to witness whatever spectacle Garrick had planned. Dorian positioned himself near the front of the gathering, close enough to observe clearly, his soldiers spreading out along the perimeter in a loose formation that had become second nature after years of maintaining order wherever the Legion traveled. He noticed the kitchen servants arriving among the crowd, drawn from their duties to witness the proceedings, and searched instinctively for the silent girl among them. He found her near the back of the gathering, her expression carefully neutral, though something in her posture suggested tension held tightly beneath a calm exterior. Enforcers moved through the crowd, and Dorian watched with growing unease as they began clearing a path toward the wooden post standing at the center of the square, the same post he had glimpsed earlier that morning, without fully understanding its purpose. Whatever was about to happen, the entire pack had clearly gathered specifically to witness it, an audience assembled for cruelty disguised as tradition. Then the enforcers moved toward the back of the crowd, toward exactly where the silent kitchen girl stood, and Dorian felt something in his chest tighten with sudden, sharp understanding. The disciplinary ritual Garrick had described was not meant for some unnamed pack member. It was meant for her. He watched, jaw clenched with barely restrained anger, as the enforcers took hold of her arms, not gently, and began leading her through the parting crowd toward the waiting post. She did not resist, did not cry out, simply allowed herself to be led forward with the same practiced stillness he had witnessed during their brief encounter the previous day, though now he recognized that stillness for what it truly was, not calm acceptance, but the exhausted resignation of someone who had endured this particular cruelty many times before, and had learned there was no benefit in fighting it. Dorian's hand moved unconsciously toward the hilt of his sword, an instinctive reaction he forced himself to suppress. Interfering directly in a pack's internal disciplinary matters, however cruel they might appear, fell outside the Legion's official mandate unless direct evidence of royal bloodline involvement could be established. He had no proof yet, only instinct and unanswered questions, nothing solid enough to justify overriding an alpha's authority within his own territory. But as he watched the enforcers bind her wrists to the post, as he watched Alpha Garrick step forward with obvious satisfaction to address the gathered crowd, Dorian found himself hoping, with an intensity that surprised him, that his instincts about this silent girl were correct. Because if she truly carried the blood of Nadia Sunwood, if she truly was the lost heir his legion had searched for across 6 months and countless northern territories, then everything happening in this square was about to change, in ways Alpha Garrick could not begin to anticipate. The crowd's murmur grew louder as Garrick raised his hands for silence, beginning what was clearly a well-practiced speech about discipline and pack unity, and the consequences awaiting those who failed to meet Emberfall Hollow's standards. Dorian barely heard the words, his full attention fixed on the girl standing bound at the post, her chin lifted despite everything, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance, as though she had found a way to remove herself entirely from the moment unfolding around her. He glanced toward Corwin, positioned nearby among the Legion's soldiers, and saw his own tension mirrored in his second's expression. Whatever happened next, Dorian understood with sudden clarity that this was the moment the Legion's long search might finally reach its conclusion, one way or another. The crowd fell silent as Garrick finished his speech and gestured toward his enforcers to begin the ritual proper. Dorian watched the girl's shoulders tense almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of whatever fear or resolve she carried within, and found himself holding his breath alongside her, waiting to see what would happen when cruelty and destiny finally collided in the center of Emberfall Hollow's ancient stone square. Dorian's mind drifted, even as his eyes remained fixed on the scene before him, to a story his father had told him many times during his childhood training, back when the Legion still served an unbroken royal line. The oath, his father had explained, was forged in the earliest days of the first Wolf King's reign, when a council of ancient wolves had bound their descendants forever to the protection of his bloodline, sealing the promise with something deeper than words, a mark placed upon their very nature that no distance, no time, and no deception could fully erase. His father had described the sensation of true recognition only once, having experienced it himself as a young soldier, standing guard over the royal nursery decades earlier. He had said it felt like a held breath finally released, like a missing piece of oneself suddenly restored without warning, an instinct too powerful to question or resist. Dorian had always wondered, in the years since his father's passing, whether he would ever experience that sensation himself, or whether the bloodline truly had ended the night the Sunwood house fell to ash and betrayal. He thought of his soldiers now, spread throughout the crowd, each one carrying that same ancient oath within them, waiting silently for a recognition none of them could consciously summon or predict. If the girl bound at the post truly carried royal blood, the response would not come from calculated decision or careful investigation. It would come instinctively, overwhelming and undeniable, the moment true contact occurred between her nature and the ancient promise carried in every Legion soldier's blood. Garrick's enforcers moved with practiced cruelty now, one of them producing a small blade meant not to wound deeply, but to mark, a ceremonial cut across the palm, meant to symbolize submission to pack authority, a tradition Dorian found himself despising more with every passing second. He watched the girl's expression remain carefully blank, even as the enforcer approached, watched her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, the only crack in an otherwise flawless mask of practiced endurance. Beside him, Corwin shifted uneasily, clearly sharing his commander's growing discomfort with the proceedings. "Commander," he murmured quietly, "our mandate does not extend to intervention in pack disciplinary matters, however troubling we may find them." "I am aware of our mandate, Corwin," Dorian replied, his voice low and controlled, despite the tension coiling tighter in his chest with every passing moment. "I have no intention of intervening without proper cause." But even as he spoke the words, some part of him wondered whether proper cause was about to reveal itself in ways none of them could fully anticipate. He watched Garrick step back, satisfied with his own display of authority, watched the enforcer with the blade draw closer to the silent girl's bound wrist, and felt the atmosphere around the entire square shift subtly, like the air itself sensed something building toward release. The crowd, sensing the approaching climax of the ritual, leaned forward collectively, some faces alight with cruel anticipation, others carefully blank in the way of those who had learned survival meant never showing sympathy for whoever occupied the post on any given day. Dorian scanned the gathered pack members one final time, searching for any sign of the truth he had spent 6 months chasing across northern territories, and found himself once again drawn to the girl's eyes, fixed now not on some distant point, but directly on the approaching blade. Something flickered there, deep beneath the careful stillness she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, something that looked less like fear and more like a long dormant resolve, finally beginning to stir awake after years of forced dormancy. Dorian's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword, despite his earlier resolve to remain uninvolved. An instinct he could not fully explain, rising unbidden within him, as the enforcer's blade drew within inches of her skin. The morning sun climbed higher above Emberfall Hollow's ancient stone walls, casting long shadows across the crowded square, and somewhere beneath the surface of ordinary pack cruelty, something ancient and long buried, prepared to answer a call it had waited 17 years to hear. The blade touched her skin, and something inside Alira finally broke free. For 17 years, she had swallowed every scream, every word, every flicker of rage that rose in her throat whenever the pack reminded her of her place. She had told herself that silence was survival, that speaking meant danger, that the promise she made to her dying mother's memory mattered more than her own pain. She had believed that with unwavering certainty, through countless small cruelties and this same humiliating ritual, 3 times endured in silence. But something about today felt different. Perhaps it was the ring hidden beneath her floorboard, its weight suddenly present in her mind even though it lay far from her body. Perhaps it was the memory of the commander's pale, searching eyes, the way he had studied her as though trying to solve a puzzle only he could see the edges of. Perhaps it was simply 17 years of accumulated pain, finally reaching a breaking point it could no longer contain. Whatever the cause, as the enforcer's blade pressed against her palm, Alira felt something rise within her chest that she had no name for, hot and bright and utterly unstoppable. A pressure that had been building behind her ribs for so long, she had forgotten it was even there. Her breath caught. Her vision sharpened, every detail of the square suddenly vivid and clear, the crowd's faces, the morning light, the enforcer's hand trembling slightly, with the effort of holding steady under Alpha Garrick's watchful gaze. And then, without any conscious decision on her part, her bound hand lifted. It should have been impossible. The rope around her wrist held firm, tied by Doran's careful hands only an hour before. But somehow her arm rose anyway, rope and all, palm turning outward, in a gesture that felt older than her own memory, older than her mother's whispered warnings, older than the 17 years of silence she had carried like a stone in her chest. The enforcer froze, blade still hovering inches from her skin, his expression shifting from cruel satisfaction to sudden confusion. Behind him, throughout the crowd, something extraordinary began happening. One by one, then in rapid, rippling succession, the royal wolves stationed throughout the square dropped to one knee. It started near the front, where Corwin stood beside his commander, his body moving before his mind fully understood what was happening, knee striking stone with a sound that cracked through the sudden, stunned silence of the crowd. Then the soldiers positioned along the perimeter followed, then those stationed near the northern gate, then every single royal soldier present in Emberfall Hollow that morning, dropping in perfect unison, as though some invisible hand had pushed them all down at once. The crowd's gasps turned to stunned silence as the last soldier knelt, heads bowed, right fists pressed against their chests, in a gesture of formal submission that had not been performed in Emberfall Hollow, or likely anywhere in the Northern Territories, for over 30 years. Alira stood frozen at the post, her raised hand trembling now, not from fear, but from the overwhelming shock of what she had just witnessed. 10,000 warriors, or however many had actually accompanied the visible 30 into this pack's territory, bound by an oath older than any living memory, had just recognized something in her that she herself barely understood. Alpha Garrick's face had drained of all color. He stood frozen at the center of the square, staring at the kneeling soldiers with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning horror, as though the ground beneath his feet had just revealed itself to be far less solid than he had always assumed. The silence stretched, unbearable and absolute, until finally, one voice broke through it. "Rise," Commander Dorian Ashgrave said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned square, though it shook slightly with an emotion Alira could not name. He remained kneeling himself even as he spoke the command, his pale eyes fixed on her with an intensity that felt like it might burn straight through the careful mask she had worn her entire life. "All of you, rise, but maintain formation. We do not yet have full confirmation." His soldiers rose smoothly, but their formation shifted, subtly but unmistakably, arranging themselves in a loose protective circle around the post where Alira still stood. her wrist still bound by rope now hanging loosely from her raised arm. The enforcer with the blade had backed away entirely, his weapon lowered, his expression a mixture of confusion and something close to fear. Dorian rose last of all and approached the post slowly, each step deliberate, his soldiers parting to allow him passage while maintaining their protective formation around the perimeter. Elira watched him approach with her heart hammering so violently she feared it might be visible through her tunic, her raised hand finally lowering as the strange compulsion that had lifted it in the first place began to fade. He stopped a few feet before her, close enough that she could see the emotion warring behind his carefully controlled expression, disbelief and hope, and something that looked almost like relief after a very long search finally reaching its end. "What is your name?" he asked quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she, and perhaps those closest to the post, could hear the question clearly. Elira opened her mouth, 17 years of careful silence pressing against her throat like a physical weight, the same instinct that had kept her safe for so long screaming at her to remain quiet, to protect herself the only way she knew how. But something had shifted irrevocably in the last few moments. Some door she had kept locked for nearly 2 decades now standing open, impossible to close again. "Elira," she said, her voice rough and unpracticed from years of disuse, barely more than a whisper, but audible in the profound silence of the square. A ripple moved through the crowd at the sound of her voice, shock upon shock, as the pack members who had known her for years, who had mocked her silence and assumed her voice broken beyond repair, heard her speak, for what many of them believed was the very first time. Dorian's expression shifted at the sound of her name, something that looked almost like recognition passing across his features, though Elira could not understand why a simple name would carry such weight for a stranger. "Elira," he repeated softly, as though testing the word, searching for something familiar within it. "Do you know your mother's name?" The question hung in the air between them, and Elira felt the full weight of 17 years of secrecy pressing against her chest one final time, before she finally released it. "Nadia," she said, her voice growing steadier, with each word spoken aloud after so many years of silence. "Nadia Sunwood." The reaction from the surrounding soldiers was immediate and overwhelming. A collective sound rose from the gathered legion, not quite a cheer, more reverent than that, closer to a held breath finally released after decades of waiting. Several soldiers pressed their fists more firmly against their chests, heads bowing lower, while others simply stared at her, with expressions of stunned wonder that made Elira's chest tighten with an emotion she could not fully name. Dorian himself seemed momentarily unable to speak, his composed commander's demeanor cracking just slightly around the edges as he processed the confirmation he had spent 6 months searching for across countless northern territories. "Your mother," he said finally, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion, "was heir to the throne of the first Wolf King's line, which makes you, by ancient law and by the blood running through your veins, the rightful heir to that same throne, and the one this legion has sworn to serve and protect above all else." The crowd's murmuring grew louder, disbelief and shock rippling through Emberfall Hollow's gathered pack members as they struggled to reconcile everything they thought they knew about the silent Omega they had spent years mocking and dismissing with this sudden, impossible revelation. Elira caught sight of Talia near the edge of the crowd, her friend's face frozen in an expression of pure astonishment, hands pressed against her mouth, as though physically holding back a gasp. Alpha Garrick found his voice at last, though it emerged strained and unsteady, nothing like his usual commanding tone. "This is impossible," he said, though the words carried little conviction even as he spoke them. "The child of that bloodline died with her mother, decades ago. Everyone knows this." "Everyone believed this," Dorian corrected, his gaze never leaving Elira's face, as though he feared she might disappear if he looked away for even a moment. "Because that is precisely what those who orchestrated the Sunwood Purge wished the world to believe. But the Legion's oath does not lie, Alpha Garrick, and does not respond to false claims or wishful assumptions. What you have just witnessed is recognition older and more absolute than any written record, any political convenience, any carefully constructed lie." Garrick's eyes darted between Dorian and Elira, calculation visible beneath his obvious panic, as he began to understand the full implications of what had just occurred within his own territory. "If this is true," he said slowly, choosing his words with evident care, "then Emberfall Hollow has had the honor of protecting a member of the royal bloodline for these many years, without even realizing the significance of what we sheltered. The blatant attempt at reframing years of cruelty into some kind of protective service made Alira's chest tighten with a fresh wave of anger, sharper now than the fear that had governed her for so long. She thought of every stone thrown at her during previous rituals, every mocking word, every night spent alone in her small storage room, while the rest of the pack enjoyed warmth and community denied to her. Protection was not the word she would have chosen for 17 years of careful, constant cruelty. But before she could find the words to respond, whether spoken aloud in her newly reclaimed voice or through some other means entirely, Dorian stepped closer, positioning himself subtly between her and Garrick, a protective gesture that felt instinctive rather than calculated. "The Legion will require accommodation for an extended stay," Dorian said, his tone leaving no room for argument despite its measured formality. "We must confirm this recognition through proper ceremony, and ensure the heir's safety, while further investigation determines the full circumstances of her survival and the threats that may still exist against her." Garrick's jaw tightened, clearly recognizing the shift in power that had just occurred within his own territory, his authority suddenly subordinate to the will of a legion he had assumed would depart within the day. "Of course, Commander," he said, though the words emerged through visibly gritted teeth. "Emberfall Hollow remains entirely at the Legion's service." Dorian turned back to Alira, and for a moment, his carefully controlled commander's expression softened into something more human, more uncertain, as though he too struggled to fully comprehend the magnitude of what had just unfolded. "You have spent your entire life hidden and unprotected," he said quietly, meant only for her ears, despite the continued murmuring of the crowd around them. "That ends today. I give you my word, and the word of every soldier under my command, that you will never again face the kind of treatment you endured in this square." Alira studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda, finding instead only sincerity so raw it startled her. 17 years of learned distrust warred within her against the strange, undeniable pull she had felt toward this stranger, since the moment he first rode into Emberfall Hollow. A pull that made sudden, overwhelming sense, now that she understood exactly what bond connected her fate to his, and to every soldier kneeling in the square around them. "Why?" she asked, her voice still rough, but growing steadier. "Did none of you find me sooner? 17 years I lived, believing myself abandoned, forgotten, alone." The question landed with visible weight, and Dorian's expression tightened with something that looked like genuine regret. "The Legion believed the entire Sunwood bloodline extinguished for 30 years, he said honestly. "We only learned 6 months ago that a child had survived, smuggled north before assassins could complete their purge. We have searched every northern territory since receiving that information, and Emberfall Hollow was simply the pack where our search finally bore fruit." He paused, something more personal entering his tone. "I am sorry, Alira. Sorry that you endured so much before we found you. Sorry that my Legion failed you for so many years, through simple ignorance of your survival." The sincerity in his apology, offered so openly before an entire crowd of onlookers, struck Alira with unexpected force. She had grown so accustomed to cruelty and indifference that genuine remorse felt almost foreign, difficult to fully trust, despite every instinct telling her this stranger meant exactly what he said. Around them, the soldiers maintained their protective formation, and Alira became gradually aware of the pack members watching from the edges of the square, expressions ranging from awe to calculation, to, in a few cases, visible resentment at watching someone they had spent years tormenting suddenly elevated to a status none of them could have imagined possible. She caught Doran's eye briefly, the enforcer who had bound her wrists that very morning, and watched him look away quickly, unable to meet her gaze now that the power dynamic between them had shifted so dramatically and so publicly. "What happens now?" she asked, directing the question to Dorian, though she suspected even he did not have complete answers to offer. "Now," Dorian said, "we begin the process of confirming your identity through proper ceremony, informing the wider Legion Council of what has been discovered, and ensuring your safety, while we investigate what threats might still exist against the last surviving member of the royal bloodline." He glanced briefly toward Garrick, still standing rigid and uncertain nearby, before returning his full attention to Alira. "But first, if you are willing, I would ask you to walk with me somewhere more private, where we might speak freely without an audience, and where you might finally receive answers to questions you have surely carried for many years. Elira looked around the square one final time, at the crowd still processing the impossible revelation they had just witnessed, at Talia's astonished but clearly supportive expression near the edge of the gathering, at Alpha Garrick's barely concealed panic as he began calculating how this unexpected development might affect his own position within the pack hierarchy. Then she looked back at Dorian, at the 10,000 or however many soldiers whose ancient oath had just recognized something within her that she herself was only beginning to understand. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word she spoke. 17 years of silence, finally, truly broken. "I would like that very much." She stepped down from the platform where she had spent countless hours over the years enduring humiliation and pain, Dorian offering his hand to steady her descent, and as her bare feet touched the cold stone of the square, Elira felt something shift permanently within her, the last remnants of the frightened, silent girl she had been giving way to someone new, someone whose story was only just beginning to unfold. As they moved through the crowd, Talia broke from her place near the edge of the gathering and rushed forward, catching Elira's free hand before the soldiers could gently redirect her. "Elira," she breathed, eyes wide with wonder, and something close to tears. "All this time, and you never said a word. I am not upset you kept the secret. I understand why you had to. I am only so glad, so incredibly glad, that you are finally safe." Elira squeezed her friend's hand, grateful beyond words for the one person in Emberfall Hollow who had shown her genuine kindness without ever expecting anything in return. "Thank you," she said, her voice still unfamiliar to her own ears after so many years of silence. "For everything. I will not forget it." Dorian waited patiently during this brief exchange, his soldiers maintaining their protective perimeter around the small group, though Elira noticed several of them watching her with expressions of quiet awe, as though simply being near her carried weight and meaning she had not yet begun to fully comprehend. When Talia finally stepped back, promising to find her later once the immediate chaos had settled, Dorian gestured toward the northern gate, leading her away from the square and the murmuring crowd still processing what they had witnessed. They walked in silence for several minutes, passing through the pack's outer buildings toward the edge of the visiting legion's camp, Elira acutely aware of the soldiers falling into formation around them, no longer the loose, scattered presence of visitors but something closer to a dedicated guard, alert and watchful in every direction. It felt strange, overwhelming even, to suddenly matter enough to warrant such careful protection after 17 years of being entirely invisible to everyone around her. "You are trembling," Dorian observed quietly, as they reached the edge of the camp, his tone carrying genuine concern rather than mere observation. Elira glanced down at her hands, surprised to find he was right, a fine tremor running through her fingers that she had not consciously noticed amid the overwhelming events of the morning. "I do not know how to process any of this," she admitted, the honesty coming easier now that the first, hardest words had already been spoken aloud. "This morning I woke, expecting nothing more than another day of quiet endurance. Now I am told I am heir to a throne I never knew existed, protected by soldiers who knelt before me without a single word of explanation, and I do not know what any of it means for who I am supposed to be." Dorian led her to a quiet space near his own tent, away from the more crowded areas of camp, and gestured for her to sit on a wooden bench positioned beneath the shade of an old oak tree that had likely stood on this land long before Emberfall Hollow existed as a pack territory. He remained standing, giving her space, though his attention never wavered from her face. "I cannot claim to fully understand what you are feeling," he said honestly, "but I can tell you what I know of your history, if you wish to hear it. Perhaps understanding your past will help you begin to understand what your future might hold." Elira nodded, hunger for answers overriding the exhaustion beginning to settle into her bones. "Please," she said. "I remember so little. Fragments mostly. My mother's hands. Running through darkness. A promise I made to never speak my true name." Dorian settled onto the ground near the bench, close enough for quiet conversation, but respectful of the space between them, and began to speak, his voice steady and measured, the voice of someone accustomed to delivering difficult truths with as much care as circumstances allowed. "Your mother, Nadia Sunwood, was the last surviving heir of the first Wolf King's royal line," he began. 30 years ago, a faction within the royal court, jealous of the Sunwood family's influence, and eager to seize power for themselves, orchestrated a purge against the entire royal household. Your grandparents were killed in that initial attack. Your mother survived only because she was away from the royal territory at the time, visiting allies in a distant pack. Elira listened, absorbing details of a history she had never known, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place after 17 years of confused, fragmented memory. She spent years in hiding, Dorian continued, protected by a small circle of loyal allies who refused to abandon the royal bloodline despite the danger involved. During that time, she met your father, though I regret I know little of him beyond his reputation as a fiercely loyal protector, who gave his life defending her during one final attack, 4 years before the night you were smuggled north. He died protecting her, Elira said softly, another fragment of memory suddenly making painful sense, a half-remembered image of grief on her mother's face that she had never fully understood as a child. Yes, Dorian confirmed gently. After his death, your mother went even further into hiding, taking you with her, moving between allied territories to avoid discovery. But 18 years ago, those seeking to eliminate any remaining trace of the royal bloodline finally located her hiding place. She had perhaps only minutes of warning before the attack began, enough time to place her signet ring in your hand, instruct her most trusted servant to flee north with you, and buy whatever time she could to ensure your escape. Elira's chest tightened painfully at this final detail, the missing piece of a memory that had haunted her for 17 years, finally given full context and devastating clarity. She died so that I could live, she said, the words heavy with grief she had never fully allowed herself to process, always too focused on simple survival to properly mourn a mother she barely remembered. She died protecting the future of an entire bloodline, Dorian said, his voice gentle but firm. A future that includes not just you, but everything your family's rule once represented to the Pax, who lived under fair and just leadership before the Purge destroyed that legacy. Your survival was not merely fortunate circumstance, Elira. It was the fulfillment of everything your mother sacrificed her life to protect. The weight of this realization settled over Elira like a physical presence, heavy and overwhelming. 17 years of assumed abandonment, reshaping itself into a legacy of profound sacrifice and enduring love. She had spent so long believing herself forgotten, unwanted, discarded by fate itself, when in truth she had been the very center of her mother's final, desperate act of devotion. I do not know if I am capable of what you seem to expect of me, she admitted quietly, old fears resurfacing even amid this overwhelming new understanding. I have spent my entire life hiding, staying silent, avoiding attention at every possible turn. I do not know how to be someone others kneel before. Dorian's expression softened further, something almost tender entering his careful commander's demeanor. No one expects you to transform overnight into someone entirely different from who you have always been, he said. The courage you showed today, lifting your hand despite years of enforced silence, speaking your true name before an entire pack that had spent years mocking you, that courage already proves you carry exactly what your bloodline requires. Leadership is not about erasing who you are, Elira. It is about allowing who you have always been, beneath the silence and the fear, to finally step into the light. Elira studied his face for a long moment, searching once again for any hint of deception or hidden agenda, finding instead only the same sincerity that had struck her earlier in the square. Something within her, long dormant beneath years of careful self-protection, began to stir with cautious, tentative hope. There is still much I do not understand, she said finally. About the threats you mentioned, about what happens next, for me, for this pack, for the Legion itself. There is time enough for those answers, Dorian assured her, rising to his feet and offering his hand to help her stand as well. For now, know only this. You are no longer alone, Elira Sunwood. Whatever comes next, an entire legion stands ready to ensure you face it with protection, and with allies who have waited far too long for the chance to finally serve you properly. Elira accepted his hand, rising from the bench with newfound steadiness despite the emotional weight of everything she had just learned, and as they walked back toward the camp together, she allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to imagine a future built not on survival alone, but on purpose, protection, and the slow, careful rebuilding of a legacy she had never known she carried within her. Behind them, unseen and unheard, Alpha Garrick stood at the edge of the pack square, watching their retreating figures with calculating eyes, already beginning to consider how this unexpected turn of events might be twisted to his own advantage, regardless of the cost to the silent girl he had spent years dismissing as worthless. By the time the sun reached its highest point, every corner of Emberfall Hollow buzzed with the news. The silent Omega, the girl nobody bothered to remember, was heir to a throne that had not existed in living memory for most of the pack. Servants whispered about it in the kitchens. Enforcers muttered about it while cleaning their weapons. Children who had once thrown stones at Alira during the marking of shame now asked their parents, in hushed and frightened voices, whether they might be punished for their part in years of cruelty. Alpha Garrick retreated to his private study, ordering all interruptions turned away except for his closest advisors, and there, behind closed doors, he began the difficult work of recalculating everything he thought he understood about his own position. His advisor, a shrewd older wolf named Soren Voss, who had served 3 alphas before Garrick and understood the currents of power better than most, arrived within the hour, summoned by an urgent message. He found Garrick pacing before the fireplace, his usual composure entirely abandoned. "Tell me this is some elaborate mistake," Garrick said the moment Soren entered, not bothering with formal greeting. "Tell me the Legion's oath can be wrong, that this recognition means nothing." Soren closed the study door carefully behind him before responding, his tone measured despite the gravity of the situation. "The Legion's oath has never been wrong, not once in the history recorded by any northern pack. If 10,000 royal soldiers knelt before that girl, then she is precisely who Commander Ashgrave claims her to be." He paused, studying Garrick's agitated expression with careful calculation. "The more pressing question, Alpha Garrick, is what this means for you, and for Emberfall Hollow's future, standing among the northern packs." Garrick stopped pacing, turning to face his advisor with sudden sharp attention. "Explain. For 17 years, this pack has housed the last surviving heir of the first Wolf King's bloodline, and treated her worse than the lowest servant," Soren said bluntly. "Every stone thrown during those rituals, every night she spent hungry and cold, while others enjoyed the pack's resources, every cruelty inflicted upon her by your own enforcers under your explicit orders, all of it is now a matter the Royal Legion is fully aware of. Commander Ashgrave witnessed the marking of shame personally, Alpha Garrick. He watched his own future queen bound to a post and threatened with a blade." The color drained further from Garrick's face as the full implications settled over him. "They could hold me accountable," he said slowly. "Strip my authority, demand punishment. They could do far worse than that," Soren said grimly. "Historical precedent among the packs allows for severe consequences against any territory found to have mistreated a member of the royal bloodline, even unknowingly. Your ignorance of her true identity may offer some small measure of protection, but ignorance alone will not erase 17 years of documented cruelty that an entire pack witnessed and, in many cases, actively participated in." Garrick sank into the chair behind his desk, the full weight of his precarious position finally settling over him with crushing clarity. "What would you have me do?" Soren considered the question carefully before answering, his advisor's mind already working through possible strategies. "Your best path forward is complete and immediate cooperation, framed as genuine remorse rather than calculated self-preservation. Offer the Legion whatever resources they require. Publicly acknowledge the girl's status and apologize for past treatment, however difficult that admission may prove. Position yourself as an ally who simply lacked the knowledge to act differently, rather than an enemy who might have acted with malice had he known the truth." "And if that is not enough?" Garrick asked, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "If the commander decides Emberfall Hollow deserves punishment regardless of my cooperation now." Soren's expression grew more troubled, and he lowered his voice further despite the closed door and empty study. "There is another possibility worth considering, Alpha Garrick, though I raise it with considerable caution. The girl herself, this Alira, has spent 17 years believing herself entirely without allies or power within this pack. She may well hold considerable resentment toward you personally, resentment that could shape whatever influence she eventually holds over Emberfall Hollow's future treatment by the Legion and the wider royal court, should her position be fully restored." Garrick's eyes narrowed with sudden, sharp calculation. "You suggest I find some way to secure her favor. or her silence. I suggest, Soren said carefully, that you consider every option available to you, however uncomfortable those options might prove. The girl's testimony, her perception of this pack's treatment of her, could determine whether Emberfall Hollow survives this revelation intact, or faces consequences severe enough to end your rule entirely, and potentially threaten the pack's continued existence altogether. The conversation left Garrick with much to consider, and as evening approached, he found himself standing at the window of his study, watching the distant lights of the Legion's camp beyond the northern wall, weighing options that ranged from genuine reform to considerably darker possibilities he was not yet willing to fully acknowledge, even to himself. Meanwhile, within the Legion's camp, Alira sat in a private tent provided for her use, still struggling to process the events of the day. Talia had been permitted to join her that evening, bringing warm food and clean clothing, along with news of how the pack had reacted throughout the afternoon to the morning's extraordinary revelations. "They are all talking about you," Talia said, settling onto a cushion across from where Alira sat wrapped in a warm blanket, still adjusting to the unfamiliar comfort of the Legion's provisions after years of sparse living conditions. Some with awe, some with obvious guilt over how they treated you all these years. A few, I think, are simply frightened of what your new status might mean for how the pack itself is judged. "I do not want anyone punished on my behalf," Alira said quietly, her voice still carrying the rough, unpracticed quality of recently reclaimed speech, though it grew stronger with every conversation. "I only want to understand what comes next, and how to navigate this new reality without losing whatever pieces of myself I have managed to preserve through all these years." "You will not lose yourself," Talia said firmly, reaching across the small space between them to squeeze Alira's hand. "Whatever title you now carry, whatever soldiers now kneel before you, you are still the same person who helped me tend wounded pack members, without complaint, who never once turned away from kindness, even when the entire pack showed you nothing but cruelty. That person does not disappear simply because the world finally recognizes who you truly are." Alira felt tears gathering at the corner of her eyes, an unfamiliar sensation after years spent carefully suppressing every visible emotion, for fear of appearing weak before a pack eager to exploit any perceived vulnerability. "Thank you," she said softly, "for staying my friend through all of it, for not treating me differently now, even knowing what I apparently am." "You are the same Alira," Talia said simply, "just finally allowed to be seen for who you have always been." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Corwin, Dorian's steady second in command, who appeared at the tent entrance with careful respect, requesting permission to enter before delivering an update on the day's developments. "Commander Ashgrave asked me to inform you," Corwin said once Alira had granted permission for him to speak, "that formal confirmation of your identity has been sent to the Legion Council, along with request for guidance on next steps regarding your protection and eventual reintegration into royal court structures, should you choose to pursue that path." "Should I choose?" Alira repeated, latching onto the phrasing with evident surprise. "I have a choice in this matter?" Corwin's expression softened slightly, an unusual display of warmth from a soldier normally defined by strict military bearing. "The Legion serves the royal bloodline, Alira Sunwood, but we do not command it. Your future path remains entirely your own decision to make. Some heirs throughout history have chosen full restoration to royal authority. Others have chosen quieter lives, accepting the Legion's protection, without pursuing formal political power. The choice belongs to you alone." This revelation settled over Alira with unexpected weight, a strange kind of freedom she had not anticipated amid the overwhelming events of the day. She had assumed, perhaps naturally given the dramatic morning ceremony, that her path forward had already been determined the moment 10,000 soldiers knelt before her. Learning that genuine choice remained available to her felt almost as significant as the original revelation of her heritage itself. "What would Commander Ashgrave recommend?" she asked, curious despite herself about the opinion of the man who had spent 6 months searching for her across countless northern territories. Corwin hesitated slightly before answering, choosing his words with evident care. "The commander does not typically offer opinions on matters he considers entirely the heir's decision to make. But if I may speak more personally, having served alongside him for many years, I believe he hopes you will choose whatever path allows you genuine safety and fulfillment, regardless of whether that path involves reclaiming full royal authority or living a quieter life under the Legion's continued protection. Something in the careful phrasing suggested there was more Corwin might have said had formal military discretion not restrained him, but Illyra did not press further, sensing the boundaries of what remained appropriate for this particular conversation. Instead, she thanked him for the update and watched him take his leave, promising to return with further information as the Legion Council's guidance arrived in the coming days. Once Corwin had departed, Talia turned to Illyra, with obvious curiosity written across her expressive features. "You like him," she observed, not quite a question. "The commander." Illyra felt heat rise in her cheeks, an unfamiliar sensation given how carefully she had guarded every emotion for so many years. "I barely know him," she said, though the protest carried less conviction than she intended. "You barely know anyone outside this pack," Talia pointed out reasonably, "and yet something about him clearly affects you differently than the rest of these soldiers, however kind they have all been toward you today." Illyra did not answer directly, though her thoughts drifted unbidden to their conversation beneath the old oak tree, to the careful gentleness with which he had explained her mother's history, to the genuine regret in his voice when he apologized for the Legion's 17-year failure to find her sooner. Whatever she felt toward Dorian Ashgrave remained complicated and uncertain, tangled together with gratitude, curiosity, and something else she was not yet ready to fully name. Outside the tent, evening had fully settled over the Legion's camp, torches casting warm light across the orderly rows of soldiers going about their nightly routines. Somewhere beyond the northern wall, within Emberfall Hollow's pack square, Alpha Garrick continued weighing dangerous possibilities against the safer path of genuine cooperation, his decision far from settled despite Soren's careful counsel. And far beyond both the pack and the Legion's temporary camp, in territories neither Illyra nor Dorian yet fully understood, word of the morning's extraordinary events had already begun traveling along old, secretive channels, reaching ears that had spent 30 years believing the Sunwood bloodline permanently extinguished, ears that now began, with growing alarm and calculated purpose, planning how best to correct what they had long assumed was a problem already and permanently resolved. The peace of that first evening, however welcome, after such an overwhelming day, would prove far more fragile than anyone within the Legion's camp yet realized. Later that night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body, Illyra stepped outside her tent and found the camp mostly quiet, soldiers rotating through watch shifts with the same quiet precision she had noticed throughout the day. She wrapped the blanket Talia had brought more tightly around her shoulders and walked slowly toward the edge of the camp, drawn by some restless energy she could not quite name. She found Dorian there, standing alone near the perimeter, apparently keeping watch himself despite his rank affording him the option of rest. He turned at the sound of her approach, and something in his expression, tired, but genuinely pleased to see her, eased a small measure of the tension still coiled tightly in her chest. "You should be resting," he said, though his tone carried no real reprimand, only concern. "I could say the same of you," she replied, settling beside him at a respectful distance, close enough for quiet conversation, but careful not to presume too much familiarity, given everything still uncertain between them. A faint, tired smile crossed his features. "Old habits. I find it difficult to rest fully during the first nights following significant discoveries. Too many thoughts, too many considerations for what comes next." "What does come next?" Illyra asked, genuinely curious despite the exhaustion weighing on her own thoughts. "Beyond waiting for the Legion Council's guidance, I mean." Dorian considered the question carefully before answering, his gaze drifting toward the distant tree line beyond the camp's edge. Historically, when an heir is discovered after a long absence, there are threats to consider beyond simple political adjustment. Those responsible for the original purge, 30 years ago, may still hold influence in certain territories, may still consider your survival a problem requiring resolution. We will need to move carefully. Gather more information before determining the safest path forward for your protection and eventual restoration. The mention of ongoing danger sent a chill through Illyra, despite the warm blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "You believe someone might still wish to harm me, even now, after all these years?" "I believe caution serves us better than assumption," Dorian said honestly, though his expression softened as he noticed the concern crossing her features. "But I also give you my word, Illyra, that you will not face whatever comes without protection. The Legion exists precisely for this purpose, has waited 30 years for the chance to finally serve a living heir again. We will not fail you now, not after finally finding you. Something in his sincerity eased the worst of her sudden fear, though a quieter unease remained settled beneath her ribs, a recognition that her path forward, however hopeful it appeared after the morning's extraordinary events, would not be entirely free of danger. She thought of Alpha Garrick's calculating expression as they had walked away from the square earlier that day, of Soren Voss's reputation throughout the pack as a man who valued strategic advantage above simple loyalty, and wondered how many others might view her sudden elevation as either opportunity or threat, depending on their own hidden interests. "Thank you," she said finally, meaning it more deeply than the simple words could fully convey. "For finding me, for today, for all of this, even the parts that frighten me." Dorian turned to face her fully, his pale eyes catching the dim torchlight in a way that made her breath catch unexpectedly. "You do not need to thank me for simply fulfilling an oath 30 years in the making," he said quietly. "Though I confess, finding you has meant considerably more to me than simple duty alone would explain." The admission hung between them, quiet and significant, neither quite ready to explore its full implications amid the exhaustion and uncertainty of such an overwhelming day. Instead, they stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the distant stars above Emberfall Hollow's ancient walls, until exhaustion finally won out and Alira returned to her tent, carrying with her a fragile but genuine sense of hope that had been entirely foreign to her only 24 hours earlier. She did not yet know how quickly that hope would be tested, or how far the shadows of her mother's 30-year-old betrayal still reached into the present, waiting patiently for the right moment to strike against the daughter who had finally, after 17 years of careful hiding, stepped into the light. Sleep, when it finally came, carried Alira back to a night she had spent 17 years trying to forget. She was 4 years old again in the dream, small enough that the world around her felt impossibly large, every shadow stretching longer and darker than it should. She stood in a stone hallway lit by flickering candlelight, her mother kneeling before her, hands trembling as they gripped Alira's small shoulders with desperate urgency. "Listen to me carefully," Nadia Sunwood said, her voice low and fierce, despite the fear evident in every line of her face. "Whatever happens tonight, whatever you hear or see, you must not make a sound. Do you understand? Not a single sound." Young Alira, confused and frightened by her mother's obvious terror, nodded silently, too overwhelmed to form words even if she had wanted to. Nadia pressed something cold and metal into her palm, closing Alira's small fingers around it with careful, deliberate pressure. "This ring belonged to my mother, and to her mother before that, back through generations longer than either of us can properly imagine. It carries our family's mark, the wolf and the crown of stars. Keep it hidden, keep it safe, and one day, when it is truly safe to do so, it will help others recognize who you are." "Mama," young Alira whispered, her voice barely audible even in the quiet hallway, "I am frightened." "I know, my love," Nadia said, pulling her daughter into a tight, desperate embrace. "But you must be brave now, braver than any 4-year-old should ever have to be. Petra will take you somewhere safe, far from here, and you must go with her without question, without hesitation, no matter what you hear happening behind you." Distant sounds reached them then, shouts and the clash of steel, growing steadily closer despite the thick stone walls surrounding them. Nadia's expression hardened with sudden, fierce resolve, and she rose to her feet, pressing one final kiss to Alira's forehead, before guiding her toward a narrow servant's passage, where an older wolf waited, her weathered face tight with barely controlled fear. "Petra will keep you safe," Nadia said, her voice cracking slightly, despite obvious effort to maintain composure for her daughter's sake. "Never speak your true name to anyone, not until you are certain it is safe. Never reveal what you carry. Survive, my darling girl. Whatever else happens, survive, and know that everything I do tonight, I do for you." The dream shifted then, the way dreams often did, skipping forward through fragments Alira had spent years trying to piece together into coherent memory. Running through darkness, Petra's strong arms carrying her when her small legs could no longer keep pace. The sound of distant fighting fading behind them, replaced eventually by nothing but wind through trees and Petra's labored breathing. Cold and hunger and endless walking through unfamiliar territory that seemed to stretch on forever. She woke with tears streaming down her face, the dream's emotional weight lingering even as consciousness fully returned. Sitting up in the unfamiliar comfort of the Legion's tent, she pressed her palm against her chest, feeling her heart still racing from the intensity of memory, finally given full context by everything Dorian had explained the previous day. She had known fragments of that night for 17 years, disconnected images without proper meaning. Now, understanding the full history behind those fragments, the dream carried devastating new weight. Her mother had not simply disappeared, had not abandoned her to some uncertain fate through carelessness or misfortune. She had made a deliberate, desperate choice, sending her only child to safety while remaining behind to face whatever violence approached, buying time with her own life to ensure her daughter's survival. Elira remained sitting in the darkness for a long while, allowing herself, finally, to properly grieve a mother she barely remembered but now understood, with painful, complete clarity. When dawn eventually broke over the camp, she rose and dressed, finding a simple but well-made outfit that Talia had left for her the previous evening, replacing the worn kitchen servant's clothing she had worn for so many years. Looking down at the unfamiliar quality of the fabric, she felt a strange disconnect between the person she had always understood herself to be and the person others now expected her to become. She found Dorian already awake when she emerged from her tent, reviewing reports with Corwin near the center of camp, both men pausing their conversation as she approached. "You look troubled," Dorian observed, setting aside whatever documents he had been reviewing to give her his full attention. "Did you sleep poorly?" "I dreamed of the night my mother sent me away," Elira admitted, finding it easier than expected to share such vulnerable information with him, a trust building between them that felt both surprising and somehow inevitable, given everything they had already shared. Understanding the full context now, understanding what she truly sacrificed, it changes the memory in ways I am still processing. Dorian's expression softened with genuine sympathy, and he gestured for her to sit with him near the small fire, where he and Corwin had apparently been discussing mourning matters. "Grief often changes shape when we finally understand the full truth behind old losses," he said gently. "It is natural, and important, to allow yourself space to process that grief fully, whatever form it takes." Corwin, sensing the private nature of the conversation developing, excused himself with a respectful nod, leaving Elira and Dorian alone beside the fire. She accepted a simple breakfast he offered, warm bread and tea, and found herself grateful for the quiet normalcy of the shared meal after such an emotionally overwhelming dream. "Tell me more about her," Elira said eventually, curiosity overcoming the reluctance she still felt discussing such deeply personal matters. "About my mother. You mentioned she was heir to the throne, that my grandparents were killed in the initial purge. But what was she like, as a person, beyond the political significance of her bloodline?" Dorian considered the question thoughtfully, drawing on knowledge gathered from Legion records and the memories of older soldiers who had served during the years before the purge. By all accounts, she was fiercely intelligent and deeply committed to fair leadership for all the packs under her family's protection, not merely those with wealth or influence. "My father served as a young soldier during the years she trained to eventually assume the throne, and he often spoke of her insistence on visiting even the smallest, most remote territories personally, ensuring their concerns received proper attention, rather than being dismissed by more powerful neighboring packs." Elira absorbed this information hungrily, each detail adding depth to a figure who had existed in her memory as little more than a fragmented collection of images and half-remembered sensations. "She sounds like someone I would have wanted to know properly," she said softly, "not simply as my mother, but as the person she was before everything was taken from her." "From what I understand," Dorian continued, "she showed remarkable courage, even in the years following her family's initial destruction, refusing to simply disappear entirely, despite the danger. Instead, working quietly, with loyal allies, to maintain some hope that the bloodline might eventually be restored, that the packs might one day return to fairer leadership than what replaced her family's rule." He paused, something more personal entering his tone. "The courage you showed yesterday, speaking your name aloud after 17 years of enforced silence, reflects that same quality. Whatever doubts you carry about your capacity for leadership, know that her strength clearly runs through you as well, even after everything you endured." Alira felt fresh tears threatening at his words, though these carried less pure grief and more a complicated mixture of pride and lingering uncertainty about her own capabilities. I do not know if I can live up to what she represented, she admitted honestly. I have spent my entire life simply trying to survive, not preparing myself for any kind of leadership role. No one expects transformation overnight, Dorian reminded her gently, echoing sentiments he had shared the previous day, beneath the old oak tree. Leadership can be learned, Alira. Courage, integrity, genuine care for those under your protection, these qualities you already possess, based on everything I have witnessed since arriving in Emberfall Hollow. The rest, the formal knowledge of governance and diplomacy, can be taught by those willing to guide you through the process, myself included, should you wish for such guidance. His offer, genuine and without any apparent expectation of return, touched Alira deeply. She studied his face for a long moment, noting the careful patience he had shown her since their very first encounter, the way he seemed to genuinely consider her well-being above simple political convenience or legion duty. I would welcome that guidance, she said finally, assuming I choose to pursue full restoration to whatever role my bloodline entitles me to. I confess, I remain uncertain about that choice, given everything else I am still learning to process. There is no need to decide immediately, Dorian assured her. Take whatever time you require. The Legion's protection remains yours regardless of what path you eventually choose. Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young soldier, breathless from apparent haste, who approached with obvious urgency written across his features. Commander, he said, offering a quick salute despite his evident agitation, a rider has arrived from the Southern Territories, carrying urgent word for the Legion Council regarding recent activity near the old Sunwood Territories. Dorian's expression shifted immediately, from gentle warmth to sharp, focused attention. The transformation from personal conversation to commanding officer, instant and complete. Bring him to my tent immediately, he ordered, already rising to his feet. He turned back to Alira, his expression apologetic but firm. I must attend to this. Please, remain within the protected areas of camp until I return. Alira nodded, understanding the shift in priority, even as curiosity and a growing sense of unease settled into her chest at the mention of activity near her family's original territory. She watched Dorian move quickly toward his tent, Corwin appearing from wherever he had retreated to join his commander, both men disappearing inside just as the breathless messenger arrived to deliver whatever news had prompted such urgent haste. She remained near the fire, finishing her now cold breakfast with considerably less appetite than before, worry gnawing at the edges of the fragile hope she had allowed herself to feel over the past day. Whatever news the Southern rider carried, the reaction it had prompted in Dorian suggested it carried significant weight, potentially connected to the very threats he had mentioned the previous night while they stood together near the camp's perimeter. Talia found her there a short while later, immediately noticing the tension evident in Alira's posture, despite her attempt to appear calm. What has happened? She asked, settling beside her friend with obvious concern. I do not know, Alira admitted honestly. A messenger arrived with urgent news, something about activity near my family's original territory. Dorian seemed troubled by whatever information was delivered. Talia's expression grew equally concerned. Do you think it relates to the threats he mentioned? Those who might still wish you harm? I fear it might, Alira said quietly, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warm morning sun overhead. Yesterday felt like the beginning of something hopeful, finally understanding who I am and where I come from. But I am beginning to realize that same revelation may have also announced my survival to exactly the people my mother died trying to protect me from. The two friends sat together in worried silence, watching the entrance to Dorian's tent, waiting to learn what news had arrived to potentially shatter the fragile peace that had settled over the Legion's camp during its first full night in Emberfall Hollow. Neither of them yet knew the full scope of what the Southern messenger had reported, but the mounting tension throughout the camp, soldiers moving with renewed urgency, officers conferring in low, serious voices, suggested that whatever hope yesterday's revelation had inspired now faced its first significant test. Inside his tent, Dorian listened with growing alarm as the messenger relayed detailed reports of unusual movement near the old Sunwood Territories, mercenary bands gathering under mysterious leadership, old enemies of the fallen royal house, apparently mobilizing with unexpected speed and purpose. Someone, it seemed, had already learned of yesterday's extraordinary events in Emberfall Hollow, and had begun taking active steps to ensure the newly discovered heir did not survive long enough to reclaim what her bloodline was owed. The peace Alira had allowed herself to briefly enjoy was already, less than a full day after her identity's revelation, beginning to fracture under the weight of dangers neither she nor the Legion had fully anticipated moving quite this quickly. "Tell me everything," Dorian said, gesturing for the messenger to sit while Corwin poured water for the clearly exhausted rider. "Every detail, however small it might seem." The messenger, a young scout named Rowan, who had ridden nearly 2 full days without proper rest to deliver his report, gathered his thoughts before speaking. 3 days ago, our southern outpost noticed unusual activity near the ruins of the old Sunwood stronghold, the territory abandoned since the Purge 30 years past. At first we assumed simple scavengers, packs seeking building materials from the ruins. But the pattern of movement suggested something more organized, tents appearing in formation, supply lines being established with obvious military precision. "Mercenaries," Corwin said grimly, not quite a question. "That was our initial assessment as well," Rowan confirmed. "But yesterday morning, before I departed to deliver this report, one of our scouts managed to get close enough to identify a banner flying above the largest tent in the gathering camp." He hesitated, clearly reluctant to deliver whatever news came next. "It bore the mark of House Thornwood, Commander." Dorian's expression darkened considerably at this revelation, and Corwin's jaw tightened with obvious recognition of the name's significance. "House Thornwood," Dorian repeated slowly, "was among the primary conspirators believed responsible for orchestrating the original purge against the Sunwood royal line 30 years ago. Though no direct proof was ever established sufficient for formal accusation, our Legion's historical records have long suspected their involvement. If they are gathering forces so quickly, so soon after Alira's identity became known," Corwin said, working through the implications aloud, "it suggests they either had ongoing surveillance networks throughout the northern packs, specifically watching for any sign the bloodline had survived, or someone within Emberfall Hollow itself sent word directly to them following yesterday's revelation." The second possibility settled over the tent with grim weight. Dorian thought immediately of Alpha Garrick, of Soren Voss's calculating reputation, of the desperate political maneuvering he had witnessed brewing beneath the pack's surface, even as he and Alira walked away from the square the previous day. "We must consider the possibility of betrayal from within Emberfall Hollow itself," he said carefully. "Though I have no direct proof of such involvement, the timing raises legitimate concern." "What are your orders, Commander?" Rowan asked, still visibly exhausted but attentive despite his fatigue. Dorian considered the situation carefully, weighing multiple factors before responding. "Increase the guard around Alira immediately, doubling our watch through all hours. Send additional scouts to monitor the Thornwood gathering more closely, without engaging directly, simply gathering further intelligence on their numbers and apparent intentions. And send word to the Legion Council, requesting immediate guidance, along with reinforcement should the situation continue escalating at this pace." Corwin nodded, already moving to begin implementing these orders, while Rowan accepted permission to rest before returning south, with additional messages for the outpost commanders. Once both men had departed to carry out their respective tasks, Dorian remained alone in his tent for a long moment, processing the full weight of what this new threat meant for the fragile hope that had emerged only the previous day. He thought of Alira sitting near the fire outside, her expression already troubled by the obvious urgency of the messenger's arrival, and felt a fierce, protective determination settle over him that went beyond simple duty or ancient oath. Whatever House Thornwood intended, whatever forces they were gathering near her family's abandoned territory, he would not allow 30 years of careful hiding and 17 years of quiet survival to end now. Not after finally finding her. Not after witnessing the courage she had shown in reclaiming her voice, after so many years of enforced silence. He gathered himself, composing his expression into something calmer than the alarm churning beneath his careful commander's exterior, and stepped back outside to find Alira and Talia waiting near the fire, both watching his approach with obvious, barely contained anxiety. "Tell me," Alira said immediately, rising to meet him halfway. "Whatever news arrived, I would rather know the full truth than be protected from information that concerns my own safety." Dorian studied her determined expression, recognizing in that moment the same fierce resolve her mother had apparently carried 30 years earlier, and made a decision that honored her request, rather than shielding her from difficult truths. "There is activity near your family's old territory," he said carefully. "Forces gathering under a banner historically associated with those believed responsible for the original purge against your family. It appears possible, though not yet confirmed, that news of yesterday's revelation has already reached those who might wish you harm." Elira's face paled slightly at this information, but she did not flinch away from it, absorbing the difficult truth with the same quiet strength she had demonstrated throughout the previous day's overwhelming events. "What does this mean for what happens next?" "It means," Dorian said, "that we must proceed with considerably more caution than originally planned, and that your protection becomes our absolute highest priority until we better understand the full scope of this threat." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "It also means, Elira, that the choice you face regarding your future path has become considerably more urgent, whether you choose full restoration or a quieter life under continued Legion protection. That decision may now need to come sooner than either of us anticipated yesterday." Elira absorbed this information with visible effort, the fragile hope of the previous day, now tempered by the harsh reality of ongoing danger that had followed her, apparently, from the very moment her identity became known. She thought of her mother's desperate sacrifice 30 years earlier, of Petra's exhausting flight through darkness carrying a frightened 4-year-old to safety, of 17 years spent in careful silence, specifically to avoid this exact kind of danger finding her. "Then I will need to decide quickly," she said finally, her voice carrying newfound steadiness, despite the fear evident beneath her words. "But I will not make that decision from fear alone, Dorian. Whatever I choose, I want it to reflect who I truly wish to become, not simply the safest possible response to danger." Dorian's expression softened with obvious respect at her determination, and he nodded slowly. "Then we will make certain you have both the safety and the time necessary to reach that decision properly, however urgently circumstances now press upon us." Around them, the camp's usual quiet efficiency had shifted into something more focused and alert, soldiers moving with renewed purpose as Corwin's orders regarding increased protection began taking effect throughout the perimeter. Elira watched the transformation, with a complicated mixture of gratitude and lingering unease, understanding that whatever peace she had briefly allowed herself to feel the previous evening now existed within the shadow of dangers that had apparently been waiting, patient and calculating, for exactly this moment of vulnerability following her long-hidden identity's sudden revelation. Alpha Garrick had not slept either, though for reasons considerably less noble than Dorian's watchful concern for Elira's safety. He sat in his study long after Soren Voss had departed the previous evening, staring at a small, sealed letter he had written and rewritten 3 times, before finally settling on careful, ambiguous wording. The letter contained no direct confession of wrongdoing, no explicit request for anything that might later be construed as treason against the newly discovered heir. It simply informed an old business contact, a trader who occasionally carried messages between northern and southern territories, that unusual developments had occurred in Emberfall Hollow, developments certain parties with historical interest in the Sunwood bloodline might find worth investigating. He told himself it was simple information sharing, nothing more, the kind of casual gossip that traveled between packs regardless of his involvement. He told himself that whatever happened afterward, however southern parties chose to act on such information, remained entirely beyond his control or responsibility. He did not fully believe his own justifications, even as he sealed the letter and handed it to a trusted messenger with instructions for immediate, discreet delivery. By morning, as reports began filtering back to him regarding the Legion's increased security measures and Dorian's obvious alarm following the arrival of a southern rider, Garrick understood with sinking certainty that his message had likely already produced exactly the reaction he had both hoped for and feared. If Elira faced renewed danger, if forces gathered against her so quickly following the revelation of her survival, his own careless letter may have played some role in that mobilization. He pushed the guilt aside as best he could, focusing instead on the more immediate concern of maintaining his own position within Emberfall Hollow, as the pack continued reeling from the previous day's extraordinary events. Throughout the morning, he received a steady stream of visitors, pack elders seeking guidance on how to properly address the situation, enforcers uncertain whether their previous treatment of Alira might result in personal consequences beyond whatever fell upon Garrick himself, and ordinary pack members simply seeking reassurance that Emberfall Hollow's future remained stable despite the dramatic upheaval. He addressed each visitor with carefully practiced words, expressing sympathy for Alira's difficult years within the pack, emphasizing his own supposed ignorance of her true identity, promising cooperation with whatever the Legion required moving forward. The performance felt hollow even as he delivered it, but he had learned long ago that survival within pack politics often required exactly this kind of careful, calculated presentation, regardless of genuine feeling underneath. By midday, Soren returned with updates gathered from his own network of contacts throughout the pack, settling into the chair across from Garrick's desk with his usual measured composure. The pack remains divided in its reaction, Soren reported. Many expressed genuine shame over how Alira was treated, particularly those who directly participated in previous marking of shame rituals. Others, I regret to say, seem more concerned with how this revelation might affect Emberfall Hollow's standing among neighboring territories than with any genuine remorse over past cruelty. And my own position? Garrick asked, unable to keep the anxiety from his voice, despite his best efforts at composure. Uncertain, Soren admitted honestly. The Legion has not yet indicated any formal action against your leadership. Commander Ashgrave appears entirely focused on Alira's immediate safety and the mysterious activity reported near the Southern Territories. Whether that focus provides you temporary reprieve or simply delays inevitable reckoning remains to be seen. Garrick's hands tightened on the arms of his chair at the mention of Southern activity, guilt gnawing at him despite his earlier attempts at self-justification. What activity exactly? Soren's expression sharpened with obvious curiosity at Garrick's tone. You seem unusually invested in this particular detail, Alpha Garrick. Is there something you have not shared with me regarding recent developments? Garrick hesitated, weighing the risk of confession against the danger of Soren discovering the truth through other means, and losing trust in his Alpha's judgment, at precisely the moment such trust remained most crucial. I sent a message south last evening, he admitted finally, watching Soren's expression carefully for reaction. Nothing explicit, simply informing an old contact of unusual developments here. I did not intend to endanger her, Soren. I merely thought the information might prove valuable, might perhaps be leveraged to Emberfall Hollow's advantage, should the right parties express appropriate gratitude for early warning. Soren's composed expression cracked slightly, genuine alarm replacing his usual careful neutrality. Alpha Garrick, do you understand what you may have just done? If the Legion discovers this message originated from within Emberfall Hollow, if they connect your correspondence to whatever forces are now gathering near the Sunwood territories, the consequences will extend far beyond mere political inconvenience. You will have provided direct evidence of complicity in threatening the life of the very heir this Legion has sworn absolute loyalty to protect. Garrick's face paled at Soren's stark assessment, the full weight of his own poor judgment finally settling over him with crushing clarity. I did not think it through fully, he admitted, his voice tight with genuine fear now, rather than mere political calculation. What should I do? Pray, first, that the message cannot be traced back to you specifically, Soren said grimly, and second, that whatever forces you inadvertently alerted do not succeed in whatever purpose drew them to gather so quickly. Because if they do succeed, Alpha Garrick, if any harm comes to Alira Sunwood as a result of your careless letter, no amount of careful political maneuvering will save you from the Legion's justice. The two men sat in heavy silence for a long moment, the full magnitude of Garrick's mistake settling over the study with suffocating weight. Outside, the pack continued its uneasy adjustment to the revelations of the previous day, unaware that their Alpha's own poor judgment may have already set dangerous events in motion that threatened to unravel whatever fragile peace remained possible following Alira's dramatic public recognition. Elsewhere in the pack, far removed from Garrick's guilty study, ordinary life continued with its own complicated adjustments. Doran, the enforcer who had bound Alira's wrists during the ritual, found himself unable to meet the eyes of his fellow pack members, guilt weighing heavily on him as he processed his own role in years of cruelty, now viewed through an entirely different lens. He sought out Talia that afternoon, finding her near the healer's quarters preparing supplies for the day's work, and approached with obvious hesitation. I wish to apologize, he said without preamble, his usual confident bearing entirely absent. "Not to you specifically, but I do not know how to properly reach Alira, and I understand you remain close to her even now." Talia studied him with careful appraisal, unwilling to simply forgive years of documented cruelty on his part, without genuine acknowledgement of the harm caused. "What exactly are you apologizing for, Doran? Simply following orders? Or the cruelty you showed while carrying out those orders? The satisfaction I witnessed on your face during previous rituals?" Doran flinched at her direct assessment, but did not attempt to deny its accuracy. "Both," he admitted honestly. "I told myself following Alpha Garrick's orders absolved me of personal responsibility, but that was simply convenient justification for cruelty I chose to enjoy, rather than merely endure. I do not expect forgiveness, particularly not from her. I simply wished someone to know that I recognize the harm I caused, regardless of what consequences may eventually follow." Talia considered his words carefully, recognizing genuine remorse beneath his obvious discomfort, though remaining unwilling to offer easy absolution on Alira's behalf. "If you truly wish to make amends," she said finally, "the best path forward is not seeking forgiveness for your own comfort, but genuinely changing how you treat those the pack considers vulnerable in the future, regardless of whether Alira herself ever chooses to grant you pardon." Doran nodded slowly, accepting her assessment without argument, and thanked her before departing, leaving Talia to continue her preparations, while considering the strange, complicated ways an entire pack now found itself forced to reckon with years of accumulated cruelty, all because one silent Omega had finally found the courage to lift her hand and reclaim a voice she had suppressed for far too long. By evening, word had spread throughout Emberfall Hollow that the Legion had significantly increased security around their camp, soldiers now maintaining constant watch along every perimeter, patrols extending further into surrounding territory than the previous day's more relaxed presence had suggested. Pack members whispered among themselves about the reasons behind such heightened caution, various theories circulating without any confirmed information to settle the growing uncertainty. Within his study, Alpha Garrick continued grappling with the consequences of his own poor judgment, torn between confessing his mistake directly to Commander Ashgrave in hopes of mitigating potential punishment, or remaining silent and praying his careless letter never became connected to whatever dangers now apparently threatened Alira's safety. Soren counseled continued silence, arguing that confession without absolute certainty of discovery only invited unnecessary risk, while some smaller, still functioning piece of Garrick's conscience argued for honesty, regardless of personal cost. He had not yet reached a decision when a knock came at his study door, and one of his own enforcers entered, with obvious urgency written across his features. "Alpha Garrick," the enforcer said. "Commander Ashgrave requests your immediate presence. He wishes to discuss matters of pack security, and asks specifically whether any correspondence has left Emberfall Hollow in recent days that might explain the sudden mobilization reported near the Southern Territories." Garrick's blood ran cold at the specific nature of the request, and beside him, Soren's expression tightened with matching alarm. Whatever careful deliberation Garrick had hoped to engage in, regarding confession versus continued silence, that choice had apparently just been taken entirely out of his hands. Garrick rose slowly from his desk, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him despite years of practiced composure in far less dangerous political situations. "Tell the commander I will join him immediately," he instructed the waiting enforcer, who nodded and departed to relay the message. Once alone again with Soren, Garrick turned to his advisor with barely restrained panic. "What do I say? If I confess now, under direct questioning, it will appear far worse than if I had come forward voluntarily. But if I deny any knowledge, and the connection is later proven, the consequences will be catastrophic." Soren considered the dilemma, with the same careful calculation he brought to every difficult decision, though even his usual composure showed cracks under the weight of the situation. "Honesty remains your safest option now," he said finally. "Commander Ashgrave strikes me as a man who values integrity above all else. A genuine confession, framed with appropriate context regarding your intentions, however poorly conceived, may fare better than a lie discovered through other investigation." Garrick absorbed this counsel with visible reluctance, but recognized the wisdom in it despite his fear. He straightened his shoulders, attempting to summon whatever composure remained available to him, and made his way toward the Legion's camp, Soren following a few steps behind in a show of continued support, despite his own private doubts about how this confrontation might unfold. He found Dorian waiting near the center of camp, Corwin standing beside him with an expression carefully neutral, but clearly attentive to every detail of the approaching Alpha's demeanor. Alira, Garrick noticed with a fresh wave of discomfort, stood nearby as well, apparently included in whatever discussion was about to occur. "Alpha Garrick," Dorian said, his tone formal but carrying an edge of barely restrained intensity that suggested the commander already suspected considerably more than simple routine inquiry. "We have received troubling reports of forces gathering near territories historically associated with the Sunwood bloodline's original fall. Given the timing, so soon after Alira's identity became publicly known, I find myself compelled to ask directly whether any correspondence has left this pack in recent days that might explain such rapid mobilization." Garrick felt every eye present fix upon him, Alira's included, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of curiosity and wary anticipation, as though some instinct already warned her what confession was about to follow. He glanced briefly toward Soren, who offered the smallest encouraging nod, before finally speaking. "I sent a letter," Garrick admitted, his voice unsteady despite his attempt at composed delivery. "Last evening, following the morning's revelations. I did not intend to endanger Alira directly, I want that understood clearly. I simply informed an old business contact of unusual developments here, thinking perhaps the information might eventually prove valuable to Emberfall Hollow's standing. I did not consider, in my haste and poor judgment, that such information might reach parties with dangerous intentions toward her." The silence that followed felt suffocating, every soldier within earshot turning to watch the unfolding confrontation with barely concealed tension. Dorian's expression hardened considerably, though he maintained the careful control that had characterized his bearing since arriving in Emberfall Hollow. "You may have directly endangered the life of the heir this entire legion is sworn to protect," Dorian said, his voice low and dangerous despite its measured tone. "Through what you claim was simple carelessness rather than deliberate malice. I understand the gravity of my error," Garrick said, forcing himself to meet the commander's furious gaze rather than looking away in cowardice. "I offer no excuse beyond poor judgment born of fear for my own position. Whatever consequence you deem appropriate, I will accept it." Alira, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke, her voice carrying newfound authority, despite its continued rough edges from years of disuse. "Did you know, when you sent this letter, that it might result in violence against me specifically?" Garrick turned to face her directly, recognizing that whatever fate awaited him now rested at least partially in her hands, regardless of whatever formal judgment the Legion might eventually render. "I did not think it through with such clarity," he said honestly. "I told myself it was simple information, nothing more. But I cannot claim complete ignorance of the potential danger, not truthfully. I allowed my own fear and poor judgment to override proper consideration of the consequences." Alira studied him for a long moment, 17 years of accumulated resentment, warring against whatever grace she might choose to extend even now, following such a damaging admission. "I have spent my entire life within this pack, facing consequences for choices I never made," she said finally, her voice steady, despite the emotion evident beneath her words. "I will not pretend your confession erases the danger your letter may have created, but I recognize, Alpha Garrick, that punishing you further will not undo whatever forces you have already set into motion." She turned to Dorian, her expression resolved despite the fear still evident in her eyes. "What matters now is addressing the actual threat, not simply assigning blame for how it came to be." Dorian studied her with obvious respect for her measured response, even as his own anger toward Garrick remained clearly unresolved. "The Legion Council will determine appropriate consequences for this breach," he said firmly, addressing Garrick directly. "For now, you will provide us with the exact contact you corresponded with, and any further information that might help us understand and counter whatever threat now approaches." Garrick nodded quickly, grateful for even this measure of reprieve, and began providing the requested details while Corwin took careful notes, the camp around them settling into renewed, focused urgency as the Legion began the difficult work of countering a danger that Garrick's own poor judgment had helped bring, rushing toward Emberfall Hollow considerably faster than anyone had originally anticipated. The information Garrick provided proved more useful than Dorian had initially expected. The contact named in Garrick's confession, a trader called Fyodor who moved regularly between northern and southern territories, was known to the Legion through previous intelligence gathering, suspected of maintaining connections to several parties with historical grievances against the old royal court. Within hours of receiving this information, Corwin had dispatched additional scouts to trace Fyodor's likely route south, hoping to intercept any further communication before it could reach House Thornwood's gathering forces. But even as these practical measures moved forward, Dorian found himself troubled by something Garrick's confession had inadvertently revealed, a detail so small he almost missed its significance amid the larger drama of the Alpha's admission. Garrick had mentioned, in his rambling explanation of the letter's contents, a vague reference to unusual developments in Emberfall Hollow, connected to the Sunwood name specifically, which meant that whatever information Alira had unknowingly carried within her, whatever recognition the Legion's oath had confirmed, someone within the pack beyond simply Garrick himself must have discussed her true parentage in some detail, for the Alpha to have understood enough to include such specific information in his hasty letter. Dorian found Alira later that evening, sitting alone near the fire, while the camp continued its heightened security preparations around her, and settled beside her with careful consideration for how best to raise the question weighing on his mind. "I have a difficult question," he said, watching her expression carefully. "During Garrick's confession, he mentioned understanding enough about your specific connection to the Sunwood name to include relevant detail in his letter. I find myself wondering how he came to possess such specific knowledge, given that your identity was only confirmed publicly yesterday morning." Alira considered the question, her brow furrowing slightly as she worked through the implications Dorian was clearly gesturing toward. "I do not know," she admitted honestly. "I never spoke of my mother's name to anyone within this pack, not even to Talia, until yesterday's ritual forced the truth from me." "Then how did Garrick know enough detail to write a letter specific enough to prompt such rapid mobilization from House Thornwood?" Dorian pressed gently, though his tone carried clear concern, rather than accusation directed at her. Alira's expression shifted as a new possibility occurred to her, something she had not previously considered. "Petra," she said slowly, "the servant who carried me here as a child. She died when I was 7 years old, but perhaps, before her death, she confided in someone. Perhaps that information passed through the pack in ways I never knew about, never suspected, precisely because I maintained such careful silence about my own history." This possibility troubled Dorian considerably, opening questions about how long knowledge of Alira's true identity might have existed within Emberfall Hollow's history, hidden beneath the pack's surface while she herself remained entirely unaware of who might have known her secret all along. "Do you know if Petra had any particular confidants during her years in this pack? Anyone she might have trusted with such dangerous information?" Alira thought carefully, drawing on distant childhood memories that had grown hazier with each passing year. "She was close to the previous Alpha, before Garrick assumed leadership," she said finally. "Alpha Bramwell, though he died many years ago, not long after Petra herself passed. I remember them speaking together often, though I was too young at the time to understand the significance of their conversations." "If Alpha Bramwell knew your true identity," Dorian said, working through the implications carefully, "that knowledge may have passed to Garrick during whatever transition occurred when he assumed leadership of Emberfall Hollow, which would explain how he possessed sufficient information to write such a specific letter, despite your own careful silence protecting the deepest details of your history." Alira absorbed this possibility with visible unease, a new layer of complexity added to her already overwhelming adjustment to her changed circumstances. "If Garrick has known my true identity for years," she said slowly, "known and said nothing, allowed the pack to continue treating me with such cruelty, despite understanding exactly who I truly was, that changes everything about how I understand his role in my suffering." Dorian watched her process this realization, recognizing the fresh anger building beneath her careful composure. Understandable, given everything she had already endured without full knowledge of who might have known, and chosen silence anyway. "We do not yet have confirmation of this theory," he cautioned gently. "It remains possible Garrick's knowledge came from some other, more recent source, perhaps intelligence gathered specifically, following our Legion's arrival, rather than long-held secret knowledge." "But it is possible," Alira pressed, needing to fully understand the scope of what she might be facing, "that he knew all along, and chose to continue the marking of shame rituals anyway. Chose to allow me to suffer for years, despite understanding exactly what bloodline I carried. Dorian could not offer false reassurance, given the genuine uncertainty of the situation. It is possible, he confirmed honestly, and if true, it represents a betrayal considerably more severe than the poor judgment reflected in his recent letter. They sat together in troubled silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, until Alira finally spoke again, her voice carrying a determination that suggested she had reached some internal decision during their conversation. "I need to speak with Garrick directly," she said. "I need to understand exactly what he knew, and for how long, before I can properly determine how to move forward, both regarding my own path and regarding whatever consequences he deserves for his role in my suffering." Dorian studied her expression, recognizing the genuine need behind her request, even as concern for her well-being warred against respecting her clear determination to face this difficult confrontation directly. "I will arrange the meeting," he said finally. "But I insist on being present, both for your protection and to ensure the conversation proceeds with appropriate boundaries, given everything already uncovered about his poor judgment." Alira nodded, grateful for his continued protective presence, even as she prepared herself for what promised to be an emotionally difficult confrontation with the Alpha, who had overseen years of her suffering. The meeting was arranged for the following morning, held in Dorian's own tent rather than Garrick's study, a deliberate choice, meant to place the confrontation on ground where Alira held clear advantage and protection, rather than allowing Garrick any home territory comfort. Garrick arrived looking considerably more haggard than his usual composed bearing, clearly aware that whatever conversation awaited him carried significant weight for his continued standing within both his own pack and the wider Legion's judgment. "Alpha Garrick," Alira began, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the confrontation. "I need you to answer honestly. When did you first learn of my true identity? Not simply the general suspicion that prompted your recent letter, but genuine, confirmed knowledge of my connection to the Sunwood bloodline." Garrick's expression flickered with visible discomfort, and for a long moment, Alira feared he might attempt further deception. But something in her direct gaze, in the presence of Dorian watching carefully beside her, seemed to convince him that honesty remained his only viable path forward. "Alpha Bramwell told me," he admitted finally, "shortly before his death, nearly 10 years ago now. He had known since Petra first brought you to this pack, had promised her he would protect your secret and ensure your safety for as long as possible. When he grew ill and understood his death approached, he shared this knowledge with me, along with instructions to continue that same protection." Alira felt her chest tighten with a complicated mixture of anger and disbelief at this revelation. "You have known for 10 years, she said, her voice shaking slightly, despite her effort at composure. 10 years, and you allowed the marking of shame rituals to continue regardless, allowed the pack to treat me with such consistent cruelty, despite understanding exactly who I truly was." "I did not follow Bramwell's instructions faithfully," Garrick admitted, shame evident in every line of his expression. "I told myself the rituals served a necessary purpose for pack discipline, that your specific involvement was simply coincidental, rather than deliberate targeting. But I recognize now, hearing myself say these words aloud, how hollow such justification truly sounds." "Why?" Alira demanded, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of this fresh betrayal. "If you knew who I was, if you understood the sacrifice my mother made, why would you allow such cruelty to continue?" Garrick struggled visibly to find adequate words, his usual political composure entirely stripped away by the genuine weight of Alira's direct question. "Fear, I suppose," he said finally. "Fear that if others discovered your true identity, it might threaten my own position, might invite dangerous attention to Emberfall Hollow that I was not prepared to manage. I convinced myself that maintaining your anonymity, even through continued cruelty that helped ensure no one looked too closely at your circumstances, served the greater purpose of your own protection." "That is not protection," Alira said, her voice rising with barely contained fury. "That is cowardice, dressed up in false justification to ease your own guilt. You allowed a child, and then a young woman, to suffer for years, simply because acknowledging the truth felt too dangerous for your own comfortable position." Garrick had no adequate response to offer, simply absorbing her justified anger, with visible, if belated, shame. Dorian watched the exchange carefully, ready to intervene should the confrontation require it, but recognizing that Alira needed this moment of direct confrontation, needed to fully express the anger she had suppressed alongside her voice for so many years. I do not know what consequence adequately addresses 10 years of deliberate silence in the face of ongoing cruelty, Alira said finally, some of her fury settling into weary resolve. But I want you to understand, Alpha Garrick, that whatever mercy I might eventually extend toward Emberfall Hollow as a whole, extends specifically, despite your failures, not because of any genuine leadership you provided during my years within this pack. Garrick nodded slowly, accepting her judgment without argument, understanding perhaps for the first time the full weight of consequences his years of cowardly silence had ultimately produced. I understand, he said quietly. Whatever judgment the Legion Council eventually renders, I will accept it without complaint. Dorian, watching this exchange with careful attention, found himself struck by an unexpected realization amid the tension of the confrontation. Alpha Bramwell's decade-old knowledge, and his instruction to Garrick regarding continued protection, suggested that awareness of Alira's identity had existed within certain circles for far longer than the Legion had previously understood. If Bramwell had known, others connected to him might have known as well, creating a web of awareness that extended considerably beyond simple recent discovery. Alpha Garrick, Dorian said, redirecting the conversation with careful purpose. Did Alpha Bramwell indicate how he originally learned of Alira's identity? Did he have direct contact with anyone from the original circle who helped Nadia Sunwood during her years in hiding? Garrick considered the question, drawing on memories from his conversation with the dying Alpha years earlier. He mentioned an old friendship, he said slowly, with someone he called simply the Healer, who had apparently assisted Petra during the difficult early days following Alira's arrival in this pack. I never learned this healer's full name or current whereabouts, only that Bramwell trusted this person's judgment regarding the necessity of continued secrecy. This new thread of information settled over the tent with fresh significance, opening possibilities Dorian had not previously considered regarding the wider network that may have helped protect Alira throughout her childhood, entirely unknown to her despite their crucial role in her continued survival. He glanced toward Alira, recognizing the same curiosity and cautious hope reflected in her own expression at this unexpected revelation. If this healer still lives, Dorian said carefully, they may hold information crucial not just to understanding your full history, Alira, but potentially to identifying additional threats or allies as we navigate whatever challenges lie ahead. Alira nodded slowly, processing this new possibility alongside everything else she had already learned during this difficult, revealing conversation. Whatever anger she still carried toward Garrick, whatever complicated grief remained regarding her mother's sacrifice and the years of hidden suffering that followed, this new thread offered something she had not expected amid such painful revelation, the possibility of additional connection to a past she had spent 17 years believing, entirely lost to her. I want to find this healer, she said finally, her voice steadier now despite the emotional weight of everything discussed. If they knew my mother, if they helped protect me during those first difficult years, I need to understand that part of my history as well. Alongside everything else, I am only now beginning to learn. Dorian nodded, already considering how best to pursue this new lead, while continuing to address the more immediate threat posed by House Thornwood's mobilizing forces. We will pursue every avenue available to us, he promised, both regarding your history and regarding your continued safety moving forward. As the difficult meeting finally concluded, Garrick departing with visible relief at having survived the confrontation, despite the damage done to his standing, Alira remained seated near the fire, processing the weight of everything revealed during the past hour. 10 years of Garrick's knowing silence. A mysterious healer who might hold answers to questions she had not even known to ask. The looming threat of House Thornwood's gathering forces, drawn perhaps by Garrick's careless letter, but perhaps also connected to older, deeper currents of danger that had apparently never fully stopped searching for any sign the Sunwood bloodline had survived. The path forward, she realized, remained considerably more complicated than the simple relief and hope she had allowed herself to feel just 2 days earlier, when 10,000 soldiers first knelt before her in Emberfall Hollow's ancient square. But complicated as it was, she found herself, for the first time in 17 years, genuinely curious about where that path might eventually lead, rather than simply fearful of whatever danger it might contain. Corwin returned late that afternoon with fresh reports from the scouts dispatched to trace Fyodor's southern route, finding Dorian and Alira still discussing the implications of the morning's revealing confrontation with Garrick. "We located Fyodor at a trading post 2 days south of here," Corwin reported. He confirmed delivering Garrick's message to a contact associated with House Thornwood, though he claims ignorance of the letter's full contents or significance. More concerning, he reports that Thornwood forces have grown considerably in recent days, numbering perhaps 300 armed mercenaries, with more apparently continuing to arrive from various southern territories. 300, Alira repeated, the number settling over her with fresh weight. That seems like considerable preparation for pursuing a single, previously unknown heir. It suggests this mobilization may not be entirely reactive to recent events, Dorian said grimly. House Thornwood may have maintained standing forces and ongoing surveillance networks for years, prepared for exactly this possibility of the Sunwood bloodline's eventual resurfacing, regardless of when or how such revelation might occur. This realization added fresh urgency to their situation, suggesting that whatever danger Alira faced extended beyond simple opportunistic response to recent news, representing instead long-standing, carefully maintained preparation for precisely this eventuality. Corwin continued his report, outlining additional intelligence gathered regarding the mercenary force's apparent leadership and likely strategic approach. Our scouts believe the force intends to move north within the week, Corwin said, though their exact route and timeline remain uncertain. Given their numbers, direct confrontation would prove costly even for our own significantly larger legion, particularly given our current dispersed positioning across multiple northern territories. What do you recommend? Dorian asked, deferring to his experienced second's tactical judgment. Corwin considered the question carefully before responding. I recommend consolidating our forces here in Emberfall Hollow, rather than continuing our original inspection route through other northern packs. We can send word requesting additional Legion soldiers from our southern garrisons to reinforce our current position, creating a defensive strength sufficient to discourage direct confrontation while we continue investigating both the immediate threat and Alira's broader history. Dorian nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in this cautious approach, despite the delay it would create in their originally planned inspection of other territories. Send the request for reinforcement immediately, he instructed, and continue monitoring Thornwood's movement closely, without engaging directly unless absolutely necessary. As Corwin departed to implement these orders, Alira turned to Dorian with a question that had been building throughout the afternoon's difficult discussions. What happens to Emberfall Hollow if this consolidation continues for an extended period? The pack was already struggling to adjust to yesterday's revelations, and now faces the added strain of housing a significantly expanded Legion presence indefinitely. The pack will need to adjust, Dorian said honestly, though I recognize the difficulty this creates for ordinary daily life within the territory. Perhaps, once this immediate threat has been properly addressed, we can discuss more sustainable arrangements, whether that means eventual relocation to a more secure royal territory, or continued but more measured Legion presence here in Emberfall Hollow. Alira absorbed this information, considering the wider implications of her sudden reappearance for an entire pack that had spent years operating without any awareness of the significance hidden within its own borders. I do not wish to become a burden that fundamentally disrupts this pack's way of life, she said carefully, regardless of how poorly they treated me during my years here. Many pack members had no direct role in my suffering, simply lived their own lives, unaware of the significance surrounding my presence among them. Your compassion toward those who caused you such suffering speaks well of your character, Dorian observed, genuine admiration evident in his tone, though I would caution against extending that compassion so broadly that it compromises your own safety or the practical necessities of properly addressing the threats now gathering against you. Alira nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his caution, even as she continued processing the complicated weight of her responsibility toward a pack that had shown her such inconsistent treatment throughout her years there, ranging from Talia's genuine friendship to Garrick's decade-long cowardly silence, to the casual cruelty of countless other pack members during rituals like the marking of shame. As evening settled over the camp once again, the second full day since her identity's revelation drawing toward its close, Elira found herself reflecting on how dramatically her understanding of her own life had shifted in such a short period. 2 days ago, she had been simply the silent Omega, invisible and dismissed by nearly everyone around her. Now she carried the weight of an ancient bloodline, faced gathering threats from forces she barely understood, and navigated complicated questions of loyalty and forgiveness toward a pack whose treatment of her ranged from genuine kindness to devastating betrayal. She retired to her tent that evening with considerably more to process than the previous night, though sleep, when it eventually came, proved mercifully free of the difficult dreams that had plagued her the night before. Instead, she dreamed of possibility, of a future still uncertain but no longer defined entirely by fear and forced silence. A future she was only beginning to understand she might actually have some genuine power to shape, according to her own values and choices, rather than simply enduring whatever circumstances others imposed upon her. Outside her tent, the Legion's increased security measures continued their careful, vigilant watch through the night, soldiers maintaining constant awareness of the surrounding territory, while scouts continued monitoring House Thornwood's gathering forces from a careful distance. The threat remained real and growing, but for the first time since her identity's revelation, Elira found herself facing that threat not merely as a frightened, uncertain survivor, but as someone beginning, slowly but genuinely, to understand and embrace the strength her mother had apparently always believed she carried within her. The attack came 3 nights later, and it did not come from the direction anyone expected. While Corwin's scouts continued monitoring House Thornwood's main force, gathering slowly to the south, a smaller group of trained killers had already broken away from that larger body days earlier, moving quickly and quietly through less watched territory to the east, avoiding the Legion's more obvious patrol routes entirely. By the time anyone within the camp recognized the danger, they had already breached the outer perimeter under cover of darkness. Elira woke to the sound of shouting, distant at first, then rapidly closing in around her tent. She sat up immediately, heart pounding, years of instinctive caution from her years as an overlooked Omega, rushing back with sudden, sharp clarity, despite the safety she had begun to feel within the Legion's protection over recent days. The tent flap tore open before she could fully orient herself, and a figure she did not recognize lunged inside, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone trained specifically for this exact purpose. Elira scrambled backward, years of learned survival instinct overriding panic, grabbing the small oil lamp beside her bedding and hurling it directly at the intruder's face. The lamp shattered against his shoulder, oil spilling across his dark clothing, and the brief distraction proved enough for Elira to roll away from his grasping hands and scramble toward the tent's rear opening, a secondary exit Dorian had insisted be included specifically for emergency situations exactly like this one. She burst through the rear flap into chaos. Soldiers moved in every direction, some engaging shadowy figures who had somehow infiltrated the camp's perimeter, others rushing to establish defensive formations around key positions. Elira's heart hammered against her ribs as she searched desperately for any sign of Dorian or Corwin amid the confusion. A hand closed around her arm, and she spun with instinctive fear, only to find Talia beside her, equally frightened but steady despite the danger surrounding them both. "This way," Talia said urgently, pulling her toward the center of camp where the heaviest concentration of soldiers had gathered. "We need to reach the commander." They moved quickly through the chaos, ducking between tents, avoiding the worst of the fighting that had erupted throughout the camp's perimeter. Elira caught glimpses of Legion soldiers engaging the intruders with practiced efficiency, their superior numbers and training clearly working in their favor, despite the surprise of the initial attack. But the assassins fought with a desperate, focused intensity that suggested their entire mission centered on a single objective: finding her. She understood this with sudden, sharp clarity as she and Talia rounded another tent and nearly collided with a group of 3 dark-clothed figures who had apparently anticipated exactly this route toward the camp's center. The lead assassin's eyes locked onto Elira immediately, recognition and grim satisfaction crossing his features despite the darkness. "There," he called to his companions, already moving toward her with weapon drawn. Talia stepped protectively in front of Elira, though she carried no weapon beyond simple determination, and Elira felt fresh terror rise in her chest at the thought of her friend facing danger meant entirely for her. "Run," Talia said urgently. "Find the commander." "I will." Whatever Talia intended to say was cut short as a soldier appeared from the shadows behind the assassins, engaging them with swift, decisive movements that created just enough opening for Alira to grab Talia's hand and pull her toward safety, while the fighting continued behind them. They finally reached the center of camp, finding Dorian already engaged in fierce combat with two assassins simultaneously, his movements precise and controlled despite the intensity of the fight. Corwin fought nearby, coordinating soldiers even while defending his own position, the overall battle beginning to visibly shift in the Legion's favor as more soldiers rallied to proper defensive formation, despite the initial surprise of the attack. Alira watched Dorian dispatch one assassin with efficient finality before turning his full attention to the second, and something in his focused intensity, in the protective fury evident in every movement, struck her with unexpected force even amid the chaos and danger surrounding them. The second assassin proved more skilled than the first, forcing Dorian into a more prolonged exchange, and Alira felt her heart lurch with fear as she watched the fight continue, unable to look away despite Talia's urgent tugging on her arm, trying to pull her toward greater safety, further from the immediate combat. Then, with a final decisive movement, Dorian ended the exchange, the assassin falling and remaining motionless on the ground before him. He turned immediately, searching the chaos surrounding them, and his eyes found Alira's with obvious, overwhelming relief. "Alira," he called, moving quickly toward her despite the continuing fight elsewhere in the camp. "Are you injured?" "I am unharmed," she managed, though her voice trembled with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "Talia protected me, helped me reach you." Dorian's gaze shifted to Talia with genuine gratitude. "Thank you," he said sincerely, before his attention returned fully to assessing the ongoing situation throughout the camp. "We need to move you to a more secure position immediately. This attack, however contained it appears becoming, suggests considerably more sophisticated planning than we initially anticipated from House Thornwood's forces." He guided them quickly toward a heavily guarded section of camp near the center, where several soldiers immediately formed a protective perimeter around the small group. Alira watched, still processing the terror of the past several minutes, as the fighting throughout the rest of camp gradually diminished, Legion soldiers successfully containing and defeating the remaining assassins who had managed to breach their defenses. By the time the immediate danger had fully passed, dawn had begun coloring the eastern sky, revealing the full scope of the night's chaos throughout the camp. Several tents lay damaged or destroyed, soldiers tended to various injuries sustained during the fighting, and the bodies of defeated assassins were being carefully collected for identification and investigation into their exact origins and mission details. Corwin approached Dorian and Alira as the sun fully rose, his expression grim despite the successful defense of the camp overall. "We count 9 assassins in total," he reported. "All confirmed dead, none captured alive for questioning, though we did recover various items that may help identify their specific origins and connections to House Thornwood's larger force." "Casualties on our side?" Dorian asked, his voice tight, with barely controlled tension, despite the relief of Alira's continued safety. 3 soldiers wounded, none fatally," Corwin reported. "We were fortunate the attack occurred when it did, with our security already heightened following the earlier warning regarding Thornwood's mobilization. Had this occurred during our original, more relaxed initial arrival, the outcome may have proven considerably more devastating." Alira absorbed this information with a complicated mixture of relief and horror, understanding fully for the first time the genuine, immediate danger that her survival apparently represented to certain parties, determined to see the Sunwood bloodline permanently ended. She thought of the assassin who had burst into her tent, moving with such practiced, deadly efficiency, and felt a fresh wave of fear settle into her chest, despite the immediate danger having passed. "This was not simply opportunistic response to Garrick's letter," Dorian said grimly, working through the implications of such a sophisticated, coordinated attack occurring so quickly after the initial threat's discovery. 9 trained assassins, moving with such precision and coordination, suggests considerably more advanced planning than a few days' notice would typically allow. "You believe House Thornwood maintained this force, specifically prepared for exactly this eventuality," Corwin said, echoing the theory they had discussed several days earlier regarding standing preparation rather than purely reactive mobilization. "I believe we underestimated both the resources and the determination arrayed against Alira's survival. Dorian said. This attack represents merely the opening move in what may prove a considerably longer and more dangerous campaign to eliminate the last remaining threat to whatever power House Thornwood and their allies seized following the original purge 30 years ago. Elira listened to this assessment with growing dread, understanding that the danger she faced extended far beyond a single desperate attack, representing instead a sustained, determined campaign that would likely continue, regardless of whatever defensive measures the Legion managed to implement. "What can be done?" she asked, her voice steadier now despite the fear still evident beneath her words. "To address this threat more permanently, rather than simply defending against each individual attack as it occurs." Dorian considered her question carefully, recognizing the shift in her tone from frightened survivor to someone beginning to genuinely engage with the strategic realities of her situation. "There are several possibilities," he said slowly. "We could pursue diplomatic resolution, though House Thornwood's clear determination to eliminate you entirely suggests limited appetite for negotiation on their part. We could pursue more aggressive investigation and eventual confrontation, exposing their role in both the original purge and this current campaign of violence, potentially rallying wider support among other packs against their actions. Or, if you choose full restoration to formal royal authority, that position itself would carry legal and political weight that might discourage further direct attacks, given the severe consequences such actions would invite from a properly established royal court." Elira absorbed these options carefully, recognizing that whatever choice she eventually made would carry significant implications, not just for her own safety, but for the wider political landscape of the Northern Territories and beyond. "I need time to properly consider these possibilities," she said finally. "But I recognize now, more clearly than before this attack, that whatever path I choose, I cannot simply wait passively for circumstances to resolve themselves. I must actively engage with shaping my own future, rather than allowing fear alone to determine my choices." Dorian nodded, respect evident in his expression at her growing determination, despite the terrifying circumstances of the previous night's attack. "Whatever you decide," he said, "know that the Legion stands ready to support your choice fully, whether that means pursuing formal restoration or finding some other path toward lasting safety and purpose." As the camp continued its recovery throughout the morning, soldiers repairing damaged tents and tending to the wounded, Elira found herself sitting quietly with Talia near the edge of the central protected area, both women processing the terrifying reality of how close danger had come during the previous night's chaos. "I was so frightened," Talia admitted quietly, her usual steady composure finally cracking now that immediate danger had passed. "Not just for myself, but for you, watching that assassin move toward you with such clear, deadly intent." "You protected me," Elira said, reaching for her friend's hand with genuine gratitude. "Despite the danger to yourself, you stood between me and that threat without hesitation. I will not forget that courage, Talia, not for as long as I live." Talia squeezed her hand in return, though her expression remained troubled. "I fear this will not be the last such attack," she said honestly. "Whatever path you eventually choose, Elira, I worry that danger will continue following you regardless, as long as those responsible for your family's original destruction remain free to pursue whatever agenda drove them to orchestrate such violence 30 years ago." Elira nodded slowly, recognizing the painful truth in her friend's words. The peaceful, hopeful future she had briefly allowed herself to imagine following her identity's revelation now felt considerably more complicated, shadowed by the very real, ongoing danger that her survival represented to powerful forces determined to see the Sunwood bloodline permanently ended, regardless of the cost required to achieve that goal. But even amid this sobering realization, she found herself drawing strength from an unexpected source, recognizing that whatever fear she carried now paled in comparison to the courage her mother had shown 30 years earlier, sacrificing everything to ensure her daughter's survival against exactly these kinds of determined, dangerous forces. If her mother had found the strength to make such an impossible sacrifice, Elira told herself, she could surely find the courage to properly honor that sacrifice by facing whatever challenges now lay ahead, rather than simply hiding from danger as she had for so many years of enforced silence. The morning sun continued climbing higher above Emberfall Hollow's ancient walls, illuminating a camp still recovering from the previous night's violence, but also, in its own way, illuminating a path forward that Alira found herself, despite everything, increasingly determined to walk with whatever courage and resolve she could summon from the legacy her mother had left her, carried forward now, through blood, through memory, and through the growing strength of her own reclaimed voice. Later that afternoon, Corwin returned to Dorian's tent with additional findings from the investigation into the defeated assassins, carrying a small collection of items recovered from their bodies and equipment. He spread these items carefully across the table for Dorian and Alira to examine, explaining each piece's significance as he presented them. "This blade," he said, indicating a finely crafted weapon with distinctive markings along its hilt, carries craftsmanship consistent with Southern territories under House Thornwood's direct influence. "And this," he continued, producing a small sealed letter found among the lead assassin's belongings, "appears to be a set of instructions, though written in a coded format our analysts have not yet fully decrypted." Dorian examined the letter carefully, his expression thoughtful as he considered its potential significance. "If we can decode this message, it may provide crucial insight into House Thornwood's broader strategy and timeline for further action against Alira. I have already dispatched it to our most skilled codebreaker within the reinforcement column, currently traveling north to join us," Corwin reported. "We should have results within a few days, assuming the coding method proves within her expertise to properly decipher." The Daira listened to this exchange with growing understanding of the complex, methodical work required to properly address the threat against her, a stark contrast to the simple, desperate survival instincts that had governed her life for so many years prior to this dramatic upheaval. "What will we do," she asked, "if this letter confirms further attacks are planned, perhaps with even greater resources than this initial attempt?" "We will adjust our defenses accordingly," Dorian said firmly, "and continue pursuing whatever diplomatic or investigative avenues might help address the threat at its source, rather than simply defending against each subsequent attack indefinitely." As the day progressed, word of the previous night's attack spread throughout Emberfall Hollow, prompting fresh waves of concern and, in many cases, genuine sympathy from pack members who had begun to more fully understand the real danger Alira now faced as a direct consequence of her identity's revelation. Even Alpha Garrick, still processing the consequences of his own earlier confession, sent word offering whatever additional resources Emberfall Hollow might provide to help support the Legion's defensive efforts. Alira found herself surprised by this outpouring of concern from a pack that had treated her with such consistent cruelty for so many years, though she recognized a complicated mixture of genuine remorse and self-interested political calculation, likely driving at least some portion of this newfound support. Still, she allowed herself to accept the assistance offered, recognizing that practical necessity outweighed any lingering resentment she might feel toward those now attempting, however imperfectly, to make amends for past treatment. That evening, as the camp settled into a more cautious but steadily recovering rhythm following the day's exhausting aftermath of violence and investigation, Dorian found a quiet moment to speak with Alira privately, away from the ongoing bustle of repairs and continued security preparations. "You handled last night's attack with remarkable composure," he said, genuine admiration evident in his tone. "Many, faced with such sudden direct danger, would have frozen entirely, unable to think clearly enough to seek safety as effectively as you managed, despite the chaos and fear." "I spent years learning to survive within a pack that offered me no protection or support," Alira said quietly, reflecting on the strange, difficult wisdom her years of suffering had apparently provided her, useful now, in ways she never could have anticipated. "Perhaps that difficult history, painful as it was, prepared me in some ways for exactly this kind of sudden crisis." "I am sorry," Dorian said, his voice carrying genuine regret, "that such preparation came at such a painful cost. You deserved protection and support from the very beginning, not years of suffering that merely happened to prove useful during a crisis no one should have had to face at all." Alira met his gaze, recognizing the sincere care evident in his words, and felt something warm settle in her chest, despite the exhaustion and lingering fear from the previous night's violence. "Thank you," she said softly, "for finding me when you did, however delayed that discovery came after so many years. Whatever challenges lie ahead, I am grateful, genuinely grateful, that I no longer face them entirely alone." Dorian's expression softened further at her words, and for a long, quiet moment, neither of them spoke, simply sitting together beneath the evening sky, drawing whatever comfort and strength they could from each other's presence, before the challenges of the following day inevitably demanded their full attention once again. The decoded letter arrived 6 days later, carried by the Legion's codebreaker, alongside the long-awaited reinforcement column that finally reached Emberfall Hollow in significant numbers, transforming the camp's perimeter into a considerably more formidable defensive position than the initial smaller force had managed to establish. Dorian called Illyra, Corwin, and several senior officers together immediately upon receiving the deciphered message, gathering in his tent to review its contents with careful, focused attention. "The letter confirms our worst fears," Dorian said grimly, after reviewing the translated text. "House Thornwood plans a full assault on Emberfall Hollow within the next 2 weeks, mobilizing their entire southern force, estimated now at nearly 800 armed mercenaries, alongside several allied packs who have apparently agreed to support their campaign against Illyra's survival, in exchange for promised territorial gains once the Sunwood bloodline is permanently eliminated." The number sent a chill through everyone gathered in the tent. 800 mercenaries, combined with allied pack forces, represented a considerably more serious threat than the Legion's current numbers, even with recent reinforcement, could comfortably counter through defensive measures alone. "We cannot simply wait for such an assault to arrive," Corwin said, working through the tactical implications with characteristic seriousness. "Our current position, however reinforced, was not designed to withstand a coordinated force of that magnitude." "What alternatives exist?" Illyra asked, her voice steady, despite the sobering weight of the news, months of gradual growth in confidence and understanding, evident in her measured response to such dangerous information. Dorian considered the question carefully, drawing on both tactical experience and the broader strategic considerations that had occupied his thoughts throughout the past week of careful preparation and investigation. "We have several options," he said. "We could attempt evacuation, moving you to a more secure location further north, though this risks simply delaying, rather than resolving the threat, and abandons Emberfall Hollow, to whatever consequences House Thornwood's forces might inflict upon the pack in their continued pursuit." "I will not abandon this pack to suffer for my survival," Illyra said firmly, her growing sense of responsibility toward the territory that had, despite its flaws, been her home for 17 years, now clearly evident in her immediate rejection of this option. "A second possibility," Dorian continued, "involves preemptive action, striking House Thornwood's gathering forces before they complete their mobilization, disrupting their coordination, and potentially preventing the full assault from ever materializing in its currently planned form." "Aggressive, but potentially costly," Corwin observed. "We would need precise intelligence regarding their exact positioning and readiness to execute such a strategy successfully." "A third possibility," Dorian said, his tone shifting slightly as he approached what appeared to be his actual recommendation, "involves formal escalation. Illyra publicly declares her intention to reclaim her rightful position as heir to the throne, sending word throughout the northern and southern territories alike, rallying support from packs who remember, or whose elders remember, the fair leadership her family once provided before the Purge. Such a declaration would transform this conflict from a hidden campaign of assassination into an open political struggle, one where House Thornwood's actions would face far greater scrutiny and potential consequence from packs who might otherwise remain neutral. Illyra absorbed this suggestion carefully, recognizing the significant weight of the choice being presented to her. Full public declaration meant fully embracing the role and responsibility of her bloodline, moving beyond simple survival toward active reclamation of power and authority that came with both opportunity and considerable danger. "If I make this declaration," she said slowly, working through the implications aloud, "what happens if the wider packs choose not to support my claim? What if House Thornwood's version of events, whatever narrative they construct to justify their actions, proves more persuasive than the simple truth of what actually occurred?" "There is genuine risk in that possibility," Dorian acknowledged honestly. "But I believe the truth of your survival, combined with the Legion's absolute, unwavering recognition of your bloodline, carries considerable weight that mere political maneuvering will struggle to overcome. Many packs throughout the northern and southern territories have suffered under the less equitable leadership that emerged following your family's fall. The prospect of restored fair governance may prove more compelling than House Thornwood's likely attempts at justification. Elira considered this assessment carefully, weighing the genuine risks against the potential benefits of such a bold public declaration. She thought of her mother's sacrifice 30 years earlier, of the courage that sacrifice had represented, of the 17 years she herself had spent in careful, protective silence that had ultimately failed to prevent this exact confrontation from eventually arriving regardless. "I choose declaration," she said finally, her voice carrying newfound resolve despite the fear still evident beneath her determination. "I have spent enough of my life hiding, enough years allowing fear to dictate my choices. If House Thornwood intends to pursue this conflict regardless of whatever path I choose, then I would rather face that conflict as someone actively claiming my rightful place, rather than as a frightened survivor simply hoping to avoid detection." Dorian's expression showed clear respect and something warmer at her decisive resolve, and he nodded firmly. "Then we begin preparations immediately. Corwin, draft the formal declaration for Elira's review and eventual proclamation. We will need messengers prepared to carry word throughout every northern and southern territory simultaneously, ensuring House Thornwood cannot control the narrative before word of Elira's true claim reaches wider ears." The following days passed in a blur of intense preparation, Elira working closely with Dorian and several Legion advisors to craft language for her formal declaration that honored her mother's legacy while clearly articulating her own vision for fair, just leadership moving forward. She found herself drawing on memories of Talia's genuine kindness, of the quiet dignity many ordinary pack members had shown even amid Emberfall Hollow's flawed treatment of her, shaping a vision of leadership focused on protecting exactly those kinds of overlooked, undervalued individuals who had once included herself among their number. The declaration, once finalized, was copied by numerous scribes and dispatched via dozens of Legion messengers, riding in every direction to ensure word reached as many territories as possible before House Thornwood's forces could complete their planned assault. Elira understood, as she watched these messengers depart, that there was no turning back now, that her choice had set irreversible events into motion that would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the future governance of countless packs throughout the northern and southern territories alike. Word began returning within days, some packs expressing immediate, enthusiastic support for the restoration of fair Sunwood leadership, others remaining cautiously neutral while they assessed the unfolding conflict, and a concerning few apparently already aligned with House Thornwood's interests through long-standing political or economic relationships that made immediate support for Elira's claim considerably more complicated for their own leadership to navigate. Meanwhile, scouts continued monitoring House Thornwood's mobilizing forces, reporting steady growth in their numbers, as allied packs contributed additional soldiers to their planned assault, though also noting apparent hesitation and internal debate following the widespread circulation of Elira's formal declaration, suggesting the bold political move had indeed introduced complications to what House Thornwood had likely hoped would remain a swift, decisive, and largely unnoticed elimination of their long-standing enemy. Nearly 2 weeks after the declaration's initial circulation, word arrived that House Thornwood's forces, now swollen to nearly 1,000 soldiers through continued Allied contribution, had begun their march north toward Emberfall Hollow, apparently determined to proceed with their planned assault despite the political complications Elira's declaration had introduced. Dorian gathered his officers, along with Elira herself, for a final strategic planning session as the approaching threat drew steadily closer. "Our scouts estimate their arrival within 3 days," he reported. "Our own forces, including reinforcements and allied soldiers from packs who have pledged support following Elira's declaration, number approximately 600, considerably fewer than the approaching force, but supplemented by strong defensive positioning here at Emberfall Hollow, and by soldiers whose ancient oath grants them capabilities beyond simple numerical comparison." "What capabilities do you mean specifically?" Elira asked, curious about this reference to something beyond conventional military strength. Dorian's expression grew thoughtful as he considered how best to explain something the Legion rarely discussed openly, even among their own allied forces. "The ancient oath binding our soldiers to the royal bloodline carries certain properties beyond simple loyalty and recognition," he said carefully. "When a true heir stands present during battle, particularly one who has fully embraced their position and responsibility, the oath grants Legion soldiers enhanced coordination, heightened awareness, and considerable resistance to fear or hesitation that might otherwise affect ordinary soldiers facing such overwhelming numbers. "You believe my presence during the coming battle will provide tactical advantage," Elira said, working through the implications of this revelation. "I believe it already has, in smaller ways, throughout recent weeks," Dorian said. "The soldiers who defended against the initial assassination attempt fought with remarkable coordination and effectiveness, considerably beyond what their numbers alone would typically achieve against trained killers moving with such surprise and precision. I believe, should full battle become necessary against House Thornwood's approaching force, your presence will similarly enhance our soldiers' capabilities in ways that may help offset their numerical advantage." This revelation settled over Elira with fresh weight, understanding for the first time the full scope of what her presence and active participation might mean for the coming confrontation, not merely as a symbolic figurehead requiring protection, but as someone whose very presence carried genuine tactical significance for the soldiers sworn to serve her bloodline. "Then I will be present," she said firmly, "wherever the battle requires, whatever risk that presence might carry for my own safety. If my presence genuinely strengthens our defenses, I will not hide away in some protected location while others fight and potentially die, defending a claim I myself chose to publicly declare." Dorian studied her with obvious concern, warring against clear respect for her determination. "Your safety remains paramount," he said carefully, "but I understand and respect your resolve to actively participate, rather than simply remain protected apart from the coming conflict." The final 3 days passed in intense preparation, soldiers strengthening defensive positions throughout Emberfall Hollow's perimeter, allied forces from supportive packs arriving to bolster the Legion's numbers, and Elira herself working closely with Dorian and senior officers to understand the battle plan fully, ensuring her own presence and eventual actions during the confrontation would provide maximum benefit while minimizing unnecessary risk. On the morning of the third day, scouts reported House Thornwood's forces visible on the southern horizon, their numbers even more imposing when actually witnessed approaching across the open territory surrounding Emberfall Hollow than the earlier reports had fully conveyed. Elira stood beside Dorian, near the pack's southern defensive line, watching the approaching force with a complicated mixture of fear and fierce, unwavering resolve. "Whatever happens today," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I do not regret the choice I made to declare my claim openly, regardless of how this battle concludes. I would rather face this danger directly, honoring my mother's sacrifice through genuine courage, than continue hiding in fear as I did for so many years, before your Legion found me." Dorian turned to face her fully, his expression carrying deep emotion despite the gravity of the approaching confrontation. "Your mother would be proud," he said softly, "of the courage and conviction you have shown throughout these past weeks. Whatever happens today, know that you have already honored her legacy far beyond what mere survival alone would have accomplished." The approaching force drew steadily closer, banners bearing House Thornwood's mark visible now even without magnification, alongside the mixed insignia of various allied packs who had chosen to support their campaign against the restored Sunwood claim. Elira felt her heart pounding with fear and determination in equal measure, understanding that whatever happened in the coming hours would likely determine not just her own fate, but the future direction of governance and justice throughout the northern and southern territories for generations to come. Dorian raised his hand, signaling final preparations throughout the Legion's defensive formation, soldiers tensing with readiness as House Thornwood's massive force continued its steady, inexorable approach toward Emberfall Hollow's ancient walls. The moment of confrontation, building steadily since that first extraordinary morning, when 10,000 soldiers had knelt before a silent Omega in the Pack Square, had finally, undeniably arrived. As the two forces drew within final striking distance, House Thornwood's leader, a hard-faced older wolf named Draven Thornwood himself, rode forward from his own lines, calling out across the remaining distance with a voice carrying obvious contempt and dangerous confidence. "Surrender the false heir," he demanded, "and Emberfall Hollow may yet be spared the full consequence of harboring her these many years. Resist, and we will ensure the Sunwood bloodline finally receives the complete elimination it should have suffered 30 years ago." Elira felt every soldier around her tense at this direct threat, but she stepped forward herself, past Dorian's protective positioning, raising her voice with a strength and clarity that carried across the battlefield, despite the distance still separating the two forces. "I am no false heir," she called back, her voice steady, despite the fear still evident beneath her words. "I am Elira Sunwood, daughter of Nadia Sunwood, granddaughter of the last true rulers of the first Wolf King's line. I do not seek conflict, Draven Thornwood, but I will not surrender to those who orchestrated my family's destruction 30 years ago, nor will I allow this pact to suffer for the simple act of unknowingly sheltering me during my years of hiding." Draven's expression darkened at her direct, defiant response, and he raised his own hand, signaling his massive force forward into what promised to be a devastating assault against Emberfall Hollow's considerably smaller defensive position. Elira felt Dorian's hand settle briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of both protection and solidarity, before he too raised his voice, commanding the Legion's own forces into final defensive formation. "Hold the line," he called out, his voice carrying clear authority across the assembled soldiers. "For Emberfall Hollow, for the rightful heir, for justice, 30 years delayed but not forgotten." As House Thornwood's massive force began its charge across the open territory separating the two armies, Elira felt something shift within her chest, the same strange, powerful sensation she had experienced during that first extraordinary morning in the Pack Square, when her raised hand had somehow compelled 10,000 soldiers into instant, reverent submission. Whatever ancient power ran through her bloodline, whatever connection bound her irrevocably to the Legion, now preparing to defend her claim with their very lives, she felt it stirring now, with fresh, overwhelming intensity, as the moment of true confrontation finally arrived. The charge closed the distance faster than seemed possible, House Thornwood's forces moving with the momentum of superior numbers, their front lines a wall of dark armor, and raised weapons sweeping across the open ground, toward Emberfall Hollow's waiting defenders. Elira felt Dorian position himself protectively beside her, even as he continued directing the Legion's response, soldiers shifting into tight, coordinated formations that reflected years of disciplined training, now enhanced by whatever mysterious strength her presence provided them. The two forces met with a sound Elira would never forget, and for several long, chaotic minutes, the outcome of the entire confrontation hung in genuine uncertainty. She watched from her position within the protected center of the Legion's formation, as soldiers on both sides fought with fierce determination, the Legion's superior coordination and discipline gradually beginning to offset House Thornwood's advantage in raw numbers. Draven Thornwood himself pushed forward through the chaos, apparently determined to reach Elira directly despite the soldiers working to intercept his advance, his expression carrying grim, focused intensity as he cut through the Legion's outer defensive lines with brutal efficiency. Dorian moved immediately to intercept him, positioning himself firmly between Elira and the approaching threat. "You will not reach her," Dorian said, his voice carrying absolute, unwavering resolve as he faced Draven directly. "You cannot protect her forever," Draven replied, his own voice carrying equal determination, as the two men prepared to engage in what promised to be a decisive confrontation between their respective causes. As their fight began, fierce and evenly matched despite Dorian's clear skill advantage, Elira watched with growing horror, understanding that Dorian's focus on protecting her left him vulnerable to any additional threat that might emerge from the surrounding chaos. She felt the strange, powerful sensation building within her chest intensify further, the same force that had once compelled 10,000 soldiers into instant kneeling submission, now seeming to demand release in some new, urgent form. Without fully understanding what she intended, Elira raised her hand, palm outward, the same gesture that had first revealed her true nature in Emberfall Hollow's Pack Square weeks earlier. The effect rippled outward immediately, every Legion soldier within sight suddenly moving with renewed, almost supernatural coordination, striking with perfect unified timing that began rapidly overwhelming House Thornwood's forces, despite their considerable numbers. Elira felt something powerful and undeniable flowing through her, connecting her directly to every soldier bound by the ancient oath, granting her some instinctive, unspoken ability to strengthen and guide their combined efforts, even without conscious, deliberate command. Dorian, sensing the sudden shift in the battle's momentum, pressed his advantage against Draven with renewed strength and precision, finally bringing their fierce confrontation to a decisive conclusion that left Draven Thornwood defeated and unable to continue directing his forces' assault. With their leader fallen and the Legion's coordinated defense proving increasingly overwhelming, House Thornwood's remaining forces began faltering, their initial confident momentum crumbling into confused, disorganized retreat, as the true scope of what they faced finally became clear, even to the most determined among their ranks. Elira watched, still holding her raised hand steady despite the trembling exhaustion beginning to affect her arm, as the tide of battle turned decisively in the Legion's favor. Within another hour, the confrontation had concluded entirely, House Thornwood's forces either surrendering, retreating in scattered disarray, or, in the case of their most senior remaining commanders, formally requesting terms of peace, rather than continuing a battle that had clearly turned catastrophically against their original confident expectations. Elira finally lowered her hand as the last remnants of organized resistance dissolved throughout the battlefield, exhaustion crashing over her with sudden, overwhelming force now that the immediate crisis had passed. Dorian rushed to her side immediately, his own exhaustion evident despite his victory, concern for her well-being clearly overriding whatever relief he might otherwise have felt at the battle's successful conclusion. "Are you injured?" he asked urgently, his hands gentle, as he helped steady her trembling form. "Simply exhausted," she managed, though her voice carried genuine wonder alongside the fatigue. "Whatever I just did, whatever connection allowed me to strengthen our soldiers' efforts so dramatically, it required more of me than I fully understood before attempting it." "You saved us," Dorian said softly, his expression carrying deep admiration and something warmer still. "Your presence, your willingness to actively engage, rather than simply remain protected, made the crucial difference in today's outcome. Whatever doubts you carried about your capacity for leadership, Elira, today you proved beyond any question that you carry exactly the strength and courage your bloodline requires." As soldiers throughout the battlefield began the difficult work of tending to the wounded, securing surrendered prisoners, and beginning the long process of restoring order following such intense conflict, Elira allowed herself, finally, to feel the full weight of relief that the immediate crisis had passed. She had faced the gathered forces of those responsible for her family's destruction 30 years earlier, and through some combination of her own courage and the mysterious ancient power binding her to the Legion's soldiers, she had prevailed. The path ahead remained uncertain in many ways, questions of ongoing governance, of how exactly to address House Thornwood's remaining influence, and the various allied pacts who had supported their failed campaign, of what her own eventual role within a restored royal court might fully entail. But as she stood amid the aftermath of Emberfall Hollow's decisive victory, supported by Dorian's steady presence beside her, and surrounded by soldiers whose ancient oath had finally, fully found its proper purpose after 30 years of patient waiting, Elira felt something she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. She felt, for the first time since that desperate night her mother had pressed a signet ring into her small trembling hand and sent her running into darkness, genuinely and completely safe. 3 weeks after the battle that had finally broken House Thornwood's decades-old campaign against the Sunwood bloodline, Emberfall Hollow prepared for a ceremony unlike anything the pack had witnessed in living memory. Elira stood in a small tent near the pack square, the same square where she had once endured years of humiliation and cruelty, where 17 years of enforced silence had finally broken beneath the weight of ancient recognition, watching as Talia carefully arranged the formal ceremonial clothing that would mark her official investiture as rightful heir to the throne of the first Wolf King's line. "You seem nervous," Talia observed, noticing the slight tremor in Elira's hands as she studied her own reflection in the small mirror provided for the occasion. "I am nervous," Elira admitted honestly, her voice carrying the same steady clarity it had gained over recent weeks, so different from the rough, unpracticed whisper that had first broken her 17 years of silence. "This ceremony marks not just recognition of who I am, but formal acceptance of responsibilities I am still learning to fully understand." "You have already proven yourself capable of carrying those responsibilities," Talia said firmly, adjusting the final details of Elira's ceremonial attire with careful attention. "Through the battle, through your continued efforts these past weeks negotiating fair terms with surrendered House Thornwood forces, through your insistence on ensuring Emberfall Hollow itself received proper support and protection, despite everything this pack put you through during your years here. Whatever nervousness you feel now, know that it does not reflect any genuine doubt about your capability, simply the natural weight of stepping fully into a role this significant." Alira smiled at her friend's steady encouragement, grateful beyond words for the genuine friendship that had remained constant throughout everything that had changed so dramatically over the past month. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. I do not know how I would have navigated any of this without your friendship." Talia squeezed her hand warmly before stepping back to allow final preparations to continue. Outside the tent, Alira could hear the growing sounds of the assembled crowd, considerably larger than the previous gathering that had witnessed her original public revelation, drawn now from packs throughout both northern and southern territories, who had traveled specifically to witness this historic formal restoration of proper royal leadership. Corwin arrived shortly afterward, his expression carrying obvious pride and respect as he delivered final updates regarding the ceremony's preparation. "Everything stands ready," he reported. "The Legion Council has formally confirmed your identity and claimed through their own extensive investigation these past weeks, satisfying every traditional requirement for proper restoration. Representatives from over 30 packs have gathered to witness today's ceremony, including several who initially remained neutral during the conflict, but now wish to formally pledge their support following House Thornwood's decisive defeat." "And Alpha Garrick?" Alira asked, curious about how the ceremony's preparations had affected the complicated relationship she still maintained with the pack leader whose decade-long silence had contributed so significantly to her years of suffering. "He has requested permission to address the gathered crowd briefly before your formal investiture," Corwin said carefully, "though I understand if you wish to deny that request, given everything that transpired regarding his knowledge of your identity." Alira considered this request thoughtfully, weighing her own complicated feelings against the broader political reality of maintaining stable relationships with the packs whose support her restored authority would ultimately depend upon. "I will allow it," she said finally, "though I reserve the right to respond as I see fit, should his address prove inadequate given everything that occurred." Corwin nodded, respecting her measured decision, and departed to relay this permission, while final preparations continued throughout the pack square outside. A short while later, Dorian arrived at the tent entrance, requesting permission to enter before the ceremony's official beginning. He wore formal Legion attire himself, considerably more elaborate than his usual practical armor, and Alira found herself struck once again by how much had changed since their very first encounter weeks earlier, when she had been simply an invisible kitchen servant, and he, a stranger, whose arrival had somehow felt significant, despite her inability to understand why at the time. "You look every bit the queen you are about to formally become," he said softly, genuine admiration evident in his expression as he studied her ceremonial attire. "I still feel, in many ways, like the same silent girl who spent years hiding in the kitchen shadows," Alira admitted honestly. "I wonder if that feeling will ever fully fade, or whether some part of me will always carry those years of enforced silence and fear, regardless of whatever formal title I now claim." Dorian considered her words carefully before responding. "I do not believe that feeling needs to fade entirely," he said. "The girl who learned to survive through careful silence, who found courage enough to finally speak her true name, despite years of enforced fear, that girl is not separate from the queen you are about to become. She is the foundation that Queen stands upon, the source of the genuine compassion and understanding you will bring to leadership, precisely because you know intimately what it feels like to be overlooked, undervalued, and denied protection you deserved." Alira felt tears threatening at his thoughtful words, understanding the genuine wisdom behind his perspective. Rather than needing to abandon or transcend her painful history, perhaps that history itself represented exactly the kind of lived experience that would inform her future leadership with authentic understanding, rather than abstract, theoretical concern for those her authority would eventually govern. "Thank you," she said softly, "for understanding that so clearly, when I myself struggled to fully articulate it." Dorian's expression grew warmer still, something unspoken, but clearly present, passing between them in the quiet moment before the ceremony's formal beginning, demanded their full attention once again. "Whatever role you eventually envision for the Legion, and for myself, moving forward," he said carefully, "know that I remain committed to your service, and to your well-being, regardless of whatever formal titles or arrangements eventually emerge between us." The careful phrasing suggested considerably more than simple professional commitment, and Alira felt her own cheeks warm slightly at the implication. though the ceremony's imminent beginning left little time to properly explore whatever deeper feelings had clearly been building between them throughout these past weeks of shared crisis and growing trust. "We will discuss that further," she said, allowing a small, genuine smile to show, despite the formal gravity of the approaching ceremony. "Once today's obligations have been properly fulfilled." Dorian returned her smile, understanding and clearly welcoming the implicit promise behind her words, before escorting her toward the tent entrance as the ceremony's official beginning finally arrived. The pack square, when Alira stepped into full view of the assembled crowd, looked utterly transformed from the sight of her previous humiliation. Where once a simple wooden post had stood as instrument of cruelty, now an elaborate ceremonial dais had been constructed, decorated with banners, bearing both Emberfall Hollow's traditional mark and the restored sunwood crest of a wolf howling beneath a crown of stars. Thousands of soldiers and pack representatives stood in respectful, attentive silence as she made her way toward the dais, Dorian walking beside her with careful, protective attention, despite the considerably reduced threat now that House Thornwood's forces had been decisively defeated. Alpha Garrick, as arranged, addressed the crowd briefly before her formal investiture, offering public acknowledgement of his own failures regarding years of knowing silence, expressing genuine remorse for the suffering that silence had allowed to continue, and formally pledging Emberfall Hollow's complete loyalty and support to Alira's restored authority moving forward. His words carried appropriate humility, and Alira found herself, despite everything, willing to accept this public accountability as a meaningful, if insufficient, first step toward whatever reconciliation might eventually prove possible between them. Then, as Garrick stepped back from the dais, the formal ceremony of investiture began in earnest. Legion elders, drawn from among the council members who had traveled specifically for this historic occasion, performed ancient rituals passed down through generations of royal succession, formally confirming Alira's identity and bloodline before the assembled crowd, and officially restoring the throne of the first Wolf King's line after 30 years of absence following her family's tragic fall. As the final ritual words were spoken, and a formal crown, simple but elegant in design, was placed upon her head, Alira felt the full weight of everything that had led to this moment settle over her, with profound, overwhelming significance. 17 years of silent survival, weeks of dramatic revelation and dangerous confrontation, her mother's ultimate sacrifice, finally honored through this formal restoration of everything Nadia Sunwood had died protecting. The crowd erupted into genuine, enthusiastic celebration as the ceremony concluded, soldiers and pack representatives alike cheering their new queen's formal investiture with an energy that felt worlds apart from the cruel, jeering crowd that had once gathered to witness her humiliation in this very same square. Alira raised her hand, not this time in the strange, instinctive gesture that had first revealed her true nature, but simply in grateful, genuine acknowledgement of the celebration surrounding her. Later that evening, as the formal ceremony gave way to more relaxed celebration throughout Emberfall Hollow, Alira found a quiet moment to slip away from the festivities, drawn toward the old grain house where she had once hidden during her years as an invisible kitchen servant. She found Dorian waiting there, apparently having anticipated her need for a moment of quiet reflection amid the day's overwhelming celebration. "Difficult to believe how much has changed since I first arrived in this square," he said softly, joining her in quiet contemplation of the transformed pack territory around them. "Difficult to believe how much has changed since I first found the courage to lift my hand and speak my true name," Alira agreed, reflecting on the extraordinary journey these past weeks had represented. "I spent so many years believing myself powerless, forgotten, entirely without value or purpose beyond simple survival. Now I carry responsibility for the well-being of countless packs throughout these territories, a responsibility I still sometimes struggle to fully believe I am capable of properly fulfilling." "You have already demonstrated that capability many times over," Dorian said firmly, "through courage during the battle, through wisdom during difficult negotiations, through genuine compassion, even toward those who caused you considerable harm throughout your years of hidden suffering. Whatever challenges lie ahead, Alira Sunwood, I have no doubt you will face them with exactly the strength and integrity your mother always believed you carried within you, even before you yourself fully understood that inheritance." Alira turned to face him fully, the quiet intimacy of this private moment following such a public, momentous ceremony feeling significant in its own right. "Will you remain?" she asked softly, "not simply as commander of my legion, but as someone I might continue relying upon for counsel and support as I navigate whatever comes next." "I intend to remain by your side," Dorian said, his own voice carrying quiet but unmistakable sincerity. "For as long as you will have me, in whatever capacity proves most meaningful to both of us, as our relationship continues developing beyond simple professional duty." The implicit promise behind his words settled warmly between them, a quiet acknowledgement of feelings that had grown steadily throughout these past weeks of shared crisis and mutual trust, feelings neither of them felt need to rush toward immediate, formal declaration, content instead to allow whatever connection existed between them to continue developing naturally alongside the many other significant changes now defining Elira's transformed life. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching distant celebration continue throughout the pack square, before finally returning to join the festivities properly, Elira's formal role as queen now fully established, but her deeper identity, the quiet, resilient girl who had once endured 17 years of enforced silence with remarkable, if largely unrecognized courage, remaining very much intact beneath the crown, now resting upon her head. In the weeks and months that followed, Elira's reign would prove marked by exactly the kind of fair, compassionate leadership her formal declaration had promised, drawing on her own painful history to ensure the most overlooked and undervalued members of every pack under her authority received genuine protection and consideration, rather than the casual cruelty she herself had endured for so many years. The Legion continued its faithful service, no longer waiting through decades of uncertain absence, but actively supporting a queen whose courage had proven, beyond any doubt, worthy of the ancient oath that had first recognized her true nature on that extraordinary morning when a silent Omega lifted one trembling hand, and 10,000 royal soldiers, without hesitation, knelt. A full year after that extraordinary morning in Emberfall Hollow's ancient square, Elira stood once again upon a ceremonial dais, though this time within a newly restored royal territory further south, the very lands where her mother and grandparents had once ruled, before the purge that had shattered her family, and scattered its last surviving heir across the northern territories as a frightened, silent child. The restoration of this territory had taken months of careful negotiation, rebuilding, and genuine reconciliation with packs throughout the region who remembered, in varying ways, the leadership her family had once provided. Some remembered fondly, eager to see fair governance restored after 30 years, under considerably less equitable rule. Others required more patient persuasion, understandably wary after decades of political upheaval and uncertainty regarding where true loyalty and authority properly belonged. Elira had approached each conversation, each negotiation, with the same quiet patience and genuine care that had defined her character, even during her most difficult years of enforced silence and suffering, understanding intimately what it meant to feel overlooked and uncertain, and bringing that understanding into every decision regarding how best to serve the packs, now under her expanding authority. Talia had joined her formally as a trusted advisor, her natural compassion and steady wisdom proving invaluable as Elira navigated the countless challenges inherent in restoring fair governance after decades of instability. Corwin continued his faithful service alongside the Legion, now operating with clear, unified purpose after decades spent waiting for a royal line to properly serve. And Dorian remained constantly by her side, their relationship having grown, in the months following that first ceremony of restoration, into something considerably deeper than the careful professional partnership that had first brought them together during those extraordinary early days in Emberfall Hollow. Their bond, forged through shared crisis and mutual respect, had blossomed naturally into something Elira had never dared imagine possible during her years of silent, isolated survival. A genuine partnership built on trust, understanding, and the kind of deep affection that only comes from truly knowing and valuing another person's full history, struggles, and hard-won strength. As Elira looked out over the assembled crowd gathered to witness this latest milestone in her family's restoration, representatives from dozens of packs throughout both northern and southern territories, all present to formally acknowledge her expanding authority and the genuine hope her leadership represented for more equitable governance moving forward, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought of the frightened 4-year-old child running through darkness with Petra, clutching a signet ring she barely understood the significance of. She thought of 17 years spent in careful, protective silence, enduring cruelty and dismissal she had once believed simply reflected her own inherent worthlessness. She thought of that first extraordinary morning, when her raised hand had somehow compelled 10,000 soldiers into instant, reverent recognition, breaking 17 years of silence with a single whispered name that had changed everything. Every difficult step of that journey, every painful year of suffering, and every terrifying moment of danger she had faced since her identity's revelation, had ultimately led her here, to this moment of genuine hope and restoration, standing not as the silent, overlooked Omega she had once been forced to become, but as the queen her mother had always believed she carried the strength to eventually embody. She raised her hand one final time, this gesture now familiar and comfortable, rather than instinctive and confusing, as it had first been in Emberfall Hollow's square, acknowledging the assembled crowd's genuine, enthusiastic support with quiet, confident grace. The wolf howling beneath a crown of stars, once a hidden secret pressed into a frightened child's trembling palm, now flew openly above her restored territory, a symbol no longer of desperate hiding, but of fair, compassionate leadership, finally, fully restored, after 30 long years of patient waiting. The silent Omega, who had once lifted one hand and watched 10,000 royal wolves obey her out of ancient, unbreakable oath, had become, through courage, resilience, and genuine strength of character, exactly the queen her mother had always known she was destined to be.